For 8 years, Vanessa Whitmore told herself she had accepted it. Her daughter would never hear a word she said, never hear music, never hear laughter. The world's finest specialists had confirmed it, and Vanessa, one of the most powerful women in American business, had learned to grieve in silence so her daughter wouldn't see her fall apart. Then a 37-year-old security guard noticed something every doctor, every specialist, and every expert had missed. Within 60 seconds, everything Vanessa believed about her daughter's life was wrong. And within 60 seconds after that, this quiet, unremarkable man had become the most dangerous variable in Vanessa Whitmore's perfectly controlled world. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because stories like this one drop every single week and you do not want to miss what's coming. Smash that like button if you're already feeling something. And drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The elevator doors opened on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Global Tower at 7:14 on a Thursday evening, and Logan Pierce stepped out carrying a paper cup of bad coffee and a radio he hadn't needed to use once in 4 hours. Temporary security work paid $16 an hour. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't even close to what he'd done before, but it covered Ethan's school lunches and the busted water heater he'd been ignoring since February, and that was enough of a reason to put on the navy blue jacket with the embroidered patch that said Sterling Event Security and stand near a door for 6 hours without complaining. The charity gala on 42 was the kind of event Logan Pierce had zero business being inside. Whitmore Global's annual fundraiser for children's medical research. $800 a plate, a string quartet in the corner, and more people wearing watches that cost more than his truck than he'd ever seen gathered in one room. He'd been assigned to the East Corridor, which mostly meant standing near a fire exit and redirecting the occasional lost caterer. He was fine with that. At 7:19, he noticed the little girl. She was sitting on the floor behind a large potted plant near the corridor junction, partially hidden from the main room. 8 years old, maybe. Dark hair pulled into a braid that had mostly come undone. She was wearing a dress that probably cost more than his rent, deep blue with small pearl buttons, and she was holding both knees to her chest, rocking slightly, her face tight with something that wasn't quite crying but wasn't far from it either. Logan stood still for a moment, just watching. The gala hummed 20 feet away. No one had noticed her. The catering staff moved past the corridor entrance without looking. Two guests in formal wear walked by without breaking their conversation. Logan walked over. He crouched down about 3 feet from the girl, keeping his distance, making himself smaller. He'd learned that from Ethan. Kids don't like it when adults loom. "Hey," he said quietly. "You doing okay down there?" She didn't respond, didn't look up, kept rocking. He tried again, a little louder. Nothing. He tilted his head, looked at her more carefully. Her eyes were open and tracking. She wasn't zoned out, wasn't in any kind of episode. She was simply not hearing him. But it wasn't the absence of a response he'd expect from a child who was deliberately ignoring someone. It was different. She genuinely didn't know he was there until he shifted position and his shadow moved across her line of sight. Then she flinched hard, scrambling backward into the wall, and for one terrible second her face was pure animal fear, the kind of fear that hit you right in the chest. Logan raised both hands immediately, palms open. Hey, I'm not going to hurt you. I work here." He pointed to the patch on his shoulder. "See? Security. I'm one of the safe ones." She stared at him. Her breathing was fast and shallow. But she was reading his face, his hands, his posture. Smart kid. She was doing her own assessment. Slowly, the terror dialed back. Not all the way, but enough. Logan didn't move closer. He just stayed crouched, hands visible, letting her look at him as long as she needed. And that was when he saw it. He almost missed it. The lighting in the corridor was warm but indirect, and her hair covered most of her left ear. But when she tilted her head slightly to get a better angle on his face, the braid shifted, and Logan Pierce saw something that made his entire body go still. There was something in her ear canal, not visible enough to be obvious, not large enough to catch a casual glance. But the angle was right. The light caught it for just a second, and Logan had spent enough time around classified bone conduction communications equipment, in conditions where a misaligned component could mean a man didn't hear a warning that would save his life. that his brain pattern matched before his conscious mind could catch up. Metallic, small, and from the faint, almost imperceptible luminescence, barely a flicker, more like a dying battery than anything. It had electronics inside it. He went very, very calm in the way he'd learned to go calm when the situation required it. Not detached, not cold, just focused. "Okay," he said quietly, still not moving. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to just nod or shake your head, all right?" She watched his mouth, nodded. Good. Lip reading. She'd learned to lip read. "Does your ear hurt right now? This one?" He pointed carefully to his own left ear. She stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and touched the side of her own head. Not quite pointing, more like acknowledging something she'd never been asked about before. She gave a small, uncertain shrug, which meant yes, or sometimes, or I don't know how to explain it. Any of those was enough. Logan heard footsteps behind him before he heard the voice. "What is going on here?" It wasn't a question. It was the kind of sentence that came from a woman who had spent a decade learning to make statements sound like commands, because commands were occasionally ignored and statements rarely were. Logan stood and turned, and for the second time in 3 minutes, he was struck by something he hadn't expected. Vanessa Whitmore was 30 years old and looked like she'd been awake for 48 hours and was furious about it. Her gown was elegant, and her posture was perfect, and there was a streak of mascara, barely visible, just below her left eye, that she either hadn't noticed or had decided was no one's business. Behind her stood 2 bodyguards who both had the specific expression of men who were about to physically remove him from the building. "She was sitting alone," Logan said simply. "She seemed frightened." "She's fine." Vanessa moved past him toward the girl, dropping to one knee. "Lila, baby, what are you doing out here?" The girl, Lila, turned toward her mother with the careful, deliberate movement of someone locating a sound source they can only half detect. Her face opened up immediately. She reached for Vanessa's arms. Vanessa pulled her in and held her for a moment, then looked back at Logan with an expression that wasn't quite hostility, but was definitely a clear invitation for him to return to whatever door he'd come from. "Thank you for your concern," she said. "We're fine." Logan should have nodded and walked away. He hesitated. Vanessa noticed. "Is there something else?" He looked at Lila, who had tucked herself into her mother's side and was watching him with those careful, serious eyes. "Her left ear," Logan said. "Has she been examined recently, in the last few months?" Vanessa's expression shifted. "Excuse me?" "I'm not trying to overstep." He kept his voice level. "But I noticed something. It might be nothing. My daughter is profoundly deaf. She has been examined by 12 specialists over 6 years. The words came out flat and precise, and underneath them was something Logan recognized. The exhaustion of someone who had fought the same battle for so long that any new front felt like a personal attack. "Whatever you noticed, I assure you it has been seen. Not this," Logan said. The bodyguard on the left stepped forward. "Marcus." Vanessa held up one finger without looking. The bodyguard stopped. She studied Logan for a moment. Really studied him, the way intelligent people did when they were deciding whether someone was wasting their time or genuinely believed what they were saying. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "There's a foreign object in her left ear canal, small, metallic. It has what looks like an internal component, possibly electronic." He paused. "I could be wrong, but I don't think I am." The silence stretched for several seconds. "That's not possible," Vanessa said. But her voice had changed, just slightly. The flatness was gone, replaced by something she was working to suppress. "She would have shown symptoms. She would have... How long has she been having the headaches?" Another silence. Lila looked up at her mother. Vanessa's jaw tightened. She told you that?" She touched the side of her head when I pointed to my ear. The way she did it. It wasn't the first time she'd thought about it. Logan kept his eyes on Vanessa. "I'm not a doctor. I can't tell you what it is, but I've seen components like that before, and if I'm right about what it is, it needs to come out carefully, very carefully." Vanessa looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked back at Logan. "Who are you?" she said. "And why are you working security at a charity gala?" "Logan Pierce. And it pays the bills." They used a small conference room off the main corridor, and one of the bodyguards, Marcus, who turned out to be ex-military himself and warmed up approximately 4 degrees. Once he figured out Logan wasn't delusional, located a retired otolaryngologist attending the gala as a donor guest. The doctor's name was Hargrove, and he was 64 years old and had the careful hands of a man who'd spent his career working in very small spaces. He used a pen light and a portable otoscope he'd pulled from a medical kit that the venue kept for emergencies, and for 45 seconds, he didn't say anything at all. Then he leaned back and looked at Logan with an expression that was equal parts stunned and professionally offended. "There is absolutely something in there," Hargrove said. Vanessa made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was the sound a person makes when the floor underneath them turns out not to be where they thought it was. "Can you remove it?" Logan asked. "Not safely. Not here. We need a sterile environment and imaging first. If this thing has any kind of electronic component, I need to know exactly what we're looking at before anything touches it." Hargrove straightened up and looked at Vanessa. "How long has your daughter been diagnosed as profoundly deaf?" 6 years. Her voice was almost steady. "Since she was 2. And she's had how many examinations?" 12, 13. I stopped counting. Hargrove looked at the penlight in his hand. "I want to say something, and I need you to understand I'm not being critical of your daughter's previous physicians, because I genuinely cannot explain how this was missed. But something was missed." Lila was sitting in one of the conference room chairs, watching all 3 adults with the practiced attention of a child who had learned that reading faces was sometimes the only way to understand what was happening in a room. She had one hand folded in her lap and one pressed flat against the surface of the conference table, and Logan noticed she'd been doing that, pressing her palm against surfaces, since they'd walked in. Feeling vibrations. She'd learned to feel the world she couldn't hear. He crouched down beside her chair. "Hey," he said, making sure she could see his face. "You okay?" She looked at him. Then she looked at her hand on the table, then back at him. She pointed to his hand, then to the table. He pressed his palm flat against the surface. She did the same. He tapped 3 times, slow, steady, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. Her eyes widened. She tapped back. 1, 2, 3. Something in Logan's chest did something he hadn't expected. He pushed it aside and focused. "That's a smart thing you figured out," he said. "Feeling it instead of hearing it. That was all you." She didn't understand every word, he could see that, but she caught enough to respond with the smallest, most cautious attempt at a smile he'd ever seen on a kid's face, like she was testing whether smiling was allowed. Behind him, Vanessa was on her phone calling for a car to take Lila to the medical facility she kept on permanent retainer for Whitmore Family Health Matters. Her voice was controlled and professional and utterly terrifying in its steadiness, because Logan had enough experience with people under extreme stress to know that kind of control didn't come free. She was holding herself together by sheer force of habit. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "Car's downstairs, Dr. Hargrove. Can we have you follow in a separate vehicle?" "Of course." The room began to move with organized purpose, the way rooms did when very wealthy people decided something needed to happen immediately. Logan stepped back to give them space. I was halfway to the door when Lila grabbed his sleeve. He looked down. She was looking up at him with an expression he'd seen on exactly one other person's face in his life, his son Ethan, 2 years ago, on the night Logan had come home from a very bad week, and Ethan had somehow known, without being told, that his father needed someone to just not let go. Logan looked at Vanessa. She was watching. "I can find my own way out," he said. "Are you riding with us or not?" she said. "That wasn't—" He stopped, looked at Lila's hand still holding his sleeve. "I don't want to intrude on your family's—" "Mr. Pierce." Vanessa picked up her evening bag and looked at him with an expression that had run entirely out of patience for diplomatic language. "My daughter does not hold on to people. She holds on to me, and she holds on to her stuffed elephant, and for the past 4 years those have been the only 2 items on that list. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and then I'm going to stop asking and simply tell you. Are you coming with us?" Logan looked at Lila. She looked back at him, steady and serious and 8 years old. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming." Oh. The procedure took 4 hours, and what they pulled from Lila Sterling's left ear canal was smaller than Logan had expected, barely the size of a pencil eraser, but dense, with a faint internal architecture of components that the imaging team initially mistook for a naturally occurring calcification before a biomedical engineer called in from home, At 11:30 at night, took one look at the scan and sat down heavily in her chair. "That's manufactured," she said. "I know," Logan said. She looked at him sideways. "And you are?" "The security guard." She opened her mouth, closed it, and went back to looking at the scan. The device was removed with the kind of precision that required 2 physicians, a microsurgical team, and 40 minutes of absolute silence in the operating suite. Logan waited in the corridor outside with Marcus, who had stopped looking at him like a potential threat somewhere around hour 2 and had started making occasional quiet conversation that felt, by hour 3, almost like the beginning of something that might become normal. At 12:47 in the morning, a nurse came to the corridor and said they were done. At 12:49, Logan heard something. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just a sound, the kind you might miss if you weren't paying attention. A small, uncertain, slightly panicked exhale from inside the recovery room, followed by a child's voice saying something that he couldn't make out through the door, and then Vanessa's voice, higher than it had been all night, saying a single word back. Then silence. Then, soft, bewildered, like someone hearing rain for the first time in their entire life, the sound of a little girl crying. Logan leaned against the corridor wall and looked at the ceiling and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose until the pressure behind his eyes eased. Marcus, beside him, cleared his throat once and looked at the opposite wall. Neither of them said anything. There wasn't anything to say. 40 minutes later, Vanessa came out of the recovery room. Her eyes were red and her mascara was genuinely gone now, and she was holding a small cup of hospital coffee she'd clearly gotten from a vending machine somewhere and hadn't touched, because she was Vanessa Whitmore, and hospital vending machine coffee was probably the most aggressively normal object she'd held in years. She stopped in front of Logan. She heard the nurse's voice, Vanessa said, in recovery. Before she was fully awake, she heard the nurse's voice and she stopped. Started again. Her audiologist is going to need to do a full assessment. Dr. Hargrove says the interference the device was generating may have been suppressing residual auditory function for years. He doesn't know yet how much she'll... Another stop. He doesn't know. No, Logan said. He won't know for a while. Vanessa looked at the coffee cup in her hands. "Why were you working as a security guard?" she said. Not accusing, just asking. The way a person asks when they've been thinking about a question for several hours and have finally decided it's not going away. "I told you, it pays the bills." "Don't do that." He looked at her. "Don't give me the easy answer," she said. "You knew what that device was. You recognized it. You kept a frightened 8-year-old calm using techniques that are not in any childcare book I've ever read. You talked Marcus into something other than throwing you out of a conference room, which, for reference, has never happened before, because Marcus used to work for the Secret Service." She finally looked up. "So I'll ask again. Who are you?" Logan was quiet for a moment. "Someone who used to do something else," he said finally, "and who has a 7-year-old son at home who thinks I'm currently working security and doesn't know I once did considerably more complicated things than that." Vanessa studied him. "Why did you stop?" He looked at the recovery room door. "Because my son needed someone to be home," he said, "and I was the only option." Vanessa didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked down at the hospital coffee and, very deliberately, took a sip. She winced. She took another sip anyway. "Her name is Lila," she said, like she was introducing them. Like the events of the past 6 hours hadn't happened, and they were starting from somewhere more normal. "She's 8. She loves elephants and cheese crackers, and she draws pictures of fish even though she's never been to the ocean." "I know," Logan said. "She showed me one. In the conference room. She had it folded in her pocket." Vanessa looked at him. "She doesn't show people those," she said. "She's never..." She stopped again. And this time it wasn't because she was composing herself. It was because she genuinely didn't know what to do with the information. Logan didn't know what to say to that. He didn't try. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be let alone, to settle, to find their own weight. Down the corridor, a monitor beeped softly, regular and steady, and in a recovery room with pale green walls and a narrow hospital bed, an 8-year-old girl was sleeping for the first time in her life in a world that had just, without warning or preparation or any of the things humans prefer when the ground shifts, become incomprehensibly louder. The audiologist's name was Dr. Priya Nair, and she had been working with Lila Sterling for 4 years without once questioning her own diagnosis. That wasn't arrogance. It was the natural consequence of evidence. Every test she had run, every imaging study she had reviewed, every threshold measurement she had attempted had returned the same result. Profound sensorineural hearing loss, bilateral, with no measurable response in the frequencies that mattered most for speech comprehension. She had been certain. She had staked her professional reputation on that certainty in 3 separate medical opinions delivered to Vanessa Whitmore across 4 years of follow-up consultations. On the morning of the 14th, she sat across from a biomedical imaging report and a 3mm metallic capsule sealed in a specimen container, and she was not certain of anything. "I need you to understand," she said carefully, "that this device would not have been visible on a standard tympanoscopic examination. It was positioned beyond the second bend of the ear canal, which is a location that requires either specialized imaging or a degree of anatomical anomaly that, in a child this age, no one would have thought to look for without a specific reason to suspect foreign body obstruction." Vanessa sat across from her with both hands flat on the conference table and said nothing. "I'm not making excuses," Nair added. "I know you're not," Vanessa said. "Keep going." Nair looked at the imaging report. The device appears to have been generating a continuous low-frequency vibration, inaudible but measurable in the 80 to 120 Hz range. "Our working hypothesis is that this interference created a jamming effect. The cochlear nerve pathways in Lila's left ear were being perpetually overstimulated by a signal that disrupted normal auditory processing. The brain, over time, learned to discard the input entirely. It's a known phenomenon in patients with certain types of tinnitus. The brain actively suppresses a persistent unwanted signal. In Lila's case, the suppression became so complete that it presented identically to nerve deafness. So she was never fully deaf. No, Nair said it quietly. We believe she retained significant residual hearing, possibly in the moderate range, that was masked completely for most of her life. Vanessa looked at the specimen container for a long time. The device inside it was tiny and dull and completely inert now, its internal battery exhausted sometime during the previous night. It looked like something you'd find in a broken wristwatch. It was 6 years of her daughter's life. "Where did it come from?" she said. "That question isn't in my lane," Nair said carefully. "I can tell you what it did. I cannot tell you who put it there." That answer satisfied Vanessa for approximately 48 hours. Then she hired a private investigation firm. What they found, 3 weeks later, arrived in a sealed folder delivered by courier to Vanessa's personal office on the 38th floor. She read it alone with the door locked, and when she finished, she sat completely still for 11 minutes. She knew because she was watching the clock, using the numbers to hold herself together, before she picked up the phone. The former nanny's name was Clara Devins. She had worked for the Whitmore household for 7 months, starting when Lila was 14 months old, and had left abruptly, officially due to a family emergency, when Lila was 22 months. 2 months after Clara Devins left, Lila had been taken to her first pediatric audiologist for what Vanessa had assumed was a simple developmental delay in language acquisition. Clara Devins had subsequently worked for 4 other wealthy families in 3 different cities, and she had referred every one of them to the same unlicensed developmental specialist, a man who operated out of a suite of offices in a private medical building in Connecticut under a series of rotating business names and who had, according to the investigative report, a history of offering experimental therapies to families of children with developmental differences, families who were frightened and wealthy and desperate enough to try things they'd never otherwise consider. Vanessa had never hired him. She had never been referred to him. That wasn't the angle. The angle, as best the investigative firm could reconstruct it, was liability. A wealthy single mother with a child who developed a profound disability. Shortly after a nanny's tenure ended was a lawsuit waiting to happen. The device, based on technology that the investigative firm's consultants described as a crude derivative of experimental bone conduction research, appeared designed not to heal anything, but to ensure that no physician would ever connect the dots between the nanny's presence in the household and the child's condition. If Lila was profoundly deaf from an identifiable neurological cause, the 7 months Clara Devins spent in the Whitmore home became irrelevant. It was, in its own terrible way, A precise and carefully considered plan. Vanessa set the folder on her desk. She looked at the window. The city spread out below her, 40 stories down, indifferent and busy and enormous, full of people who had no idea that any of this existed. She picked up the phone and called her attorney. Then she called Logan. She wasn't entirely sure why she called him. He wasn't her attorney. He wasn't a medical professional. He was a man she'd met 11 days ago in a corridor at her own charity gala, and the only ongoing connection between them was that her daughter asked about him every morning using the picture communication cards her therapist had provided. Lila would point to the card that showed a person with dark hair and then point to the card that meant come here or where or both, depending on her mood. Logan answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he was probably in the middle of something he'd put down to answer, which she registered dimly as information about his character and filed away. They found where it came from, she said. A pause. I'm listening, she told him. Not everything, not the legal details, not the investigator's name, but the shape of it. The nanny, the specialist, the device, the timeline. She kept her voice level and moved through the information the way she moved through difficult board presentations, methodically, without letting the emotional weight of any individual fact slow her down, because if she slowed down, she would stop, and she couldn't stop yet. When she finished, Logan was quiet for a moment. How are you doing with it? He said. Not how is Lila. Not what are you going to do. How are you doing with it? The you being the critical word, the thing that almost no one in Vanessa's life remembered to ask because they assumed that someone in her position had the resources to handle everything, including themselves. I'm managing, she said. Yeah. He didn't argue with that. Is Lila okay? She's confused. The new sounds are... It's a lot. She's been having trouble sleeping. Vanessa paused. She keeps coming into my room at 2 a.m. because the building makes noise at night. The HVAC system, the elevator, things she's never heard before. She doesn't know what they are and she can't ask yet and it frightens her. That makes sense, Logan said. Her brain is trying to process input it has no reference for. Every sound she hears is essentially meaningless right now. It's just noise without context. That's exhausting, and it's frightening, and it won't get faster just because we want it to. Her audiologist said it could be a year before she has reliable speech comprehension, maybe longer. Her audiologist is probably right. Vanessa sat back in her chair. You know an unusual amount about this for a former security contractor. Another pause. Longer this time. She'd noticed he did that. Took space before he answered anything that came near whatever it was he kept behind the professional distance. I knew someone once, he said, who went through something similar, different cause, same kind of relearning curve. He didn't offer more than that, and she didn't push. Lila is 8, which actually helps. The neuroplasticity at that age is... She asked about you again this morning, Vanessa said. He stopped. With the cards, she added. She pointed to the dark hair card and the wear card 3 times before breakfast. Oh, he said, which was not a sophisticated response, but it was an honest one. I told her I'd ask, Vanessa said. So I'm asking. She heard him exhale. I have Ethan this week, his school schedule. Bring him. Ms. Whitmore, Vanessa. Your daughter is in the middle of the most disorienting experience of her life, and you're inviting a stranger 7-year-old into your home. You're not a stranger, and children do better with other children sometimes. Lila has never had... She stopped herself. Bring him, she said again, quieter. If he's willing, if you are. The pause this time was the longest yet. Saturday, Logan said finally, 2 o'clock, and we leave if it's too much for either kid. Agreed, Vanessa said. She hung up and looked at the sealed investigative folder on her desk for another long moment. Then she stood, walked to the window, and pressed her palm flat against the glass. 40 floors down, the city moved in silence that wasn't silence at all. It was just distance. She thought about a little girl pressing her palm against a conference table to feel the vibrations she couldn't hear. She thought about how long she'd been looking at the wrong thing. Ethan Pierce was 7 years old, gap-toothed, and completely unintimidated by wealth in the specific way that very young children are unintimidated by things they don't have the context to be impressed by. He walked into the Whitmore penthouse on a Saturday afternoon, looked around at the 12-foot ceilings and the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kind of view that made real estate agents weep, and said, "Do you have a dog?" "No," Vanessa said. "We don't either. Dad says maybe someday." He considered this. "We've been saying maybe someday for 2 years." "I heard that," Logan said from behind him. "I know." Ethan turned and spotted Lila, who was standing in the doorway to the living room holding her stuffed elephant against her chest and watching the newcomers with the careful, measuring expression she used for everything unfamiliar. "Is that her?" "That's Lila," Logan said. Ethan looked at Lila. Lila looked at Ethan. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Ethan held up his hand and did something Logan hadn't taught him, hadn't prompted, had absolutely no warning was coming. He waved. A simple, small, direct wave. Not a big performance of it, just, "I see you. Here I am." Lila blinked. Then slowly she lifted one hand and waved back. Ethan turned to his father with an expression of complete satisfaction. "Okay," he said. "Can I see the rest of the apartment?" Vanessa, who had been watching this exchange with her arms crossed and her brow slightly furrowed in the way she held her face when something was affecting her more than she wanted to show, said, "I'll show you," which left Logan standing in the entryway and Lila still in the living room doorway, looking at him. He walked over and crouched down. "Hey," he said. She studied his face. Then she held the elephant out toward him, not giving it, just showing, presenting it for examination, the way kids sometimes did when they wanted to share something important without committing to whether the other person deserved it yet. "That's a good elephant," Logan said seriously. "What's his name?" She tilted her head. Didn't understand the question, either the words or the concept, he wasn't sure which. He pointed to the elephant, then pointed to himself. "Logan," he said clearly, making sure she could read the shape of the word. She watched his mouth. Then she pointed to the elephant. He waited. She looked at the elephant, then back at him. Then, very carefully, she drew a shape in the air with one finger, a shape that he eventually recognized after a second attempt, as the letter E. "E?" he said. She nodded. "His name starts with E?" She nodded again, more firmly this time. "Elmer?" A vigorous head. "Definitely not Elmer." "Edmund?" Another head shake accompanied by a slight expression of disdain that was somehow endearing. "Emmett?" She considered this. Then she did the gesture that Logan had already learned meant close but not quite, a flat-handed horizontal wobble that she'd apparently developed independently as a communication tool. "Earl," Logan said. She pointed at him. "Yes, Earl." "That's a solid name for an elephant," Logan said. She tucked Earl back under her arm with the satisfaction of someone whose elephant has been correctly appreciated. Dr. Nayer's formal assessment, completed 3 weeks after the device's removal, contained a finding that she described in her report as both medically significant and professionally humbling. Lila Sterling retained measurable hearing in the moderate to moderately severe range, across the speech frequencies in her left ear, and mild to moderate residual function in her right ear that had been masked for so long by crossover neural suppression that it had never registered on any previous audiogram. She was not profoundly deaf. She had never been profoundly deaf. The distinction felt enormous and also somehow insufficient because the 6 years she had spent navigating a world without sound were real regardless of their cause, and no medical reclassification undid what those years had shaped in her. What the assessment did do was open a door that every previous specialist had believed was permanently closed. Logan read the full report in his truck, parked outside Ethan's school on a Tuesday afternoon while he waited for the 3:15 bell. He read it twice. He wasn't a physician, but he understood enough of the relevant sections: the auditory nerve integrity findings, the cortical mapping results, the plasticity indices, to understand what they meant for a child who was 8 years old with no suppressive interference and a brain that had spent years developing compensatory processing pathways that could now be redirected. He also understood what they meant for the kind of therapy program she would need and why the standard auditory rehabilitation model wasn't going to be enough. He called Vanessa from the school parking lot. "I've been thinking about something," he said when she answered. "The standard lip reading and speech therapy model that Nair is recommending. It'll work eventually, but Lila already has 2 things that most patients in her position don't have." "Which are?" "She's been reading vibration for years, tactile rhythmic input. Her brain already knows how to translate physical sensation into information. She's been doing it her whole life. And she has neural plasticity on her side. If we can build a program that starts with what she already knows, vibration, rhythm, physical pattern recognition, instead of starting from scratch with acoustic input, she'll map sound to meaning a lot faster than the standard timeline. A pause on Vanessa's end. And, "You've been researching this." "I've been thinking about it." "How long?" "Since the night at the hospital." Another pause. Longer. "You designed this in your head since the night at the hospital, and you waited 3 weeks to say something." "I wanted to see the assessment first, and I didn't want to—" He stopped. "You didn't want to overstep," Vanessa said. Flat. Not a question. "It's your daughter, and If you say security guard, I'm going to hang up and then call you back and hang up again." Logan was quiet for a second. "I was going to say I'm an outsider." "You're not an outsider." She said it quickly, and then there was a brief silence that suggested she hadn't intended to say it quite that directly. He didn't comment on it. "Send me what you have, whatever you've been working on, send it to me and I'll have Nair review it." He sent her 11 pages that night. It wasn't a formal proposal. It was notes. Some typed, some that he'd clearly converted from handwriting, with crossouts and margin additions. But the underlying framework was coherent and grounded in specific methodology. Nair called him the following morning. "Where did you study?" she said, without preamble. "I didn't. Not this specifically." "Then where does this come from?" "Operational experience with bone conduction communication equipment and a lot of time thinking about how it fails and why." A pause. "You were military?" "For a while." "What branch?" "Navy." "Doing what?" "Things I'm not going to describe in detail to my daughter's audiologist," he said. "But that involved, among other things, keeping men alive in situations where their ability to detect and interpret physical signals, sound, vibration, pressure change, was the difference between going home and not going home." Nair was quiet for a moment. "This framework," she said, "the rhythm-first approach with tactile anchoring before acoustic isolation. There's actual clinical basis for it. It's not mainstream protocol, but there's research. I'd want to modify a few sections. Modify whatever you need to. I'd also want you involved in the sessions. Lila responds to you differently than she responds to adults in clinical settings. I don't entirely understand why—" "She trusts him," Vanessa said. Logan hadn't known she was on the call. "You're on this call," he said. I'm always on this call. It's my phone." A beat. "She trusts you. She trusted you in the corridor before she trusted any of us. I don't know why either, but I've stopped questioning things I can observe directly." Nair cleared her throat. "If you're both in agreement, I'd like to propose a 12-week trial of the modified program with weekly assessment checkpoints. If we're seeing the mapping progress I think we might see, we extend. If we're not, we adjust," Logan said. "We adjust," Nair agreed. The first session happened on a Wednesday morning in the therapy room on the 3rd floor of a private rehabilitation center that Vanessa had been using for Lila's occupational therapy for 2 years. The room was small and soft-edged, foam panels on the walls, a low table, floor cushions in various colors, equipment on open shelves. It smelled like the specific combination of cleaning product and new carpet that Logan associated with every clinical setting he'd ever been inside. Lila stood in the middle of the room and looked at the equipment on the shelves with the cautious expression of a child who had been asked to engage with therapy rooms many times before and had learned to wait before committing to whether this one would be different. Logan sat on the floor, not at the table, not in a chair. On the floor, cross-legged, at her eye level, which was also below her eye level, which was the point. Lila looked down at him. He patted the floor beside him. She looked at the floor, then at him. Then she walked over, very deliberately, and sat beside him with Earl the elephant in her lap. He had a small handheld drum in his bag, nothing medical, the kind you could buy in any music store for $15. He pulled it out and set it between them. Lila looked at it. He put one hand flat on its surface. Then he tapped it once, slowly, with 2 fingers. She felt the vibration through the floor even before she looked at the drum. He saw it in her face, that specific quality of attention she got when her body had registered something before her eyes had confirmed it. He tapped again. Twice. She pressed her palm flat on the drum surface. He tapped 3 times. She looked up at him. Then she tapped the drum 3 times, matching the rhythm exactly. He added a 4th tap. She added a 4th tap back. He changed the pattern. 2 fast, 1 slow. She watched his hand, felt the surface, tried it back. Got it wrong. Tried again. Got it. They did this for 20 minutes. No words, no instruction, just pattern, response, pattern, response. The room was quiet, except for the soft percussion of the drum and the occasional note from Dr. Nair, who was sitting off to the side taking notes with the specific stillness of someone who had made a decision not to interfere with something that was working. Then Logan did something different. He tapped the rhythm and hummed the corresponding tones out loud simultaneously. Not singing, just a low, unpretentious hum that vibrated in his chest. He knew she could feel it. His body was close enough to hers. The floor transmitted it, and he'd learned that the first entry point wasn't through her ears, but through everything else. Lila froze. He kept humming, kept tapping, didn't change anything, just let it continue. Slowly, she turned her head toward him. Not to look at his face, to tilt her ear, her left ear, the one that had been liberated from 6 years of electronic interference, slightly toward the sound. Nair's pen stopped moving. Vanessa, behind the observation window, put her hand over her mouth. Lila didn't hear the hum. Not yet. Or maybe just barely, at the edge of a threshold that couldn't yet make sense of what it was receiving. But something was reaching her. Something was registering. Her face had the expression of a person standing at the edge of a doorway, not yet through it, but aware, for the first time, that the door existed. Logan kept going for another few minutes. Then he stopped, naturally, the way a song stops. Not cutting off, but settling. Lila sat still for a moment. Then she pressed her palm to the drum surface again, even though he wasn't tapping anymore. She was checking, making sure the vibration was gone, confirming the boundary between sound and silence by touch, because that was the language she'd built her whole understanding of the world on. He put his own palm next to hers on the drum. Still. Nothing. She looked at him. He nodded. Yes. It stopped. She took her hand away. She looked at Earl. Then she looked back at Logan and did something he hadn't seen her do before, so she leaned sideways very slightly until her shoulder touched his arm. Not a hug. Nothing as committed as a hug, just contact. Just, I'm here, you're here, that was something. Logan sat very still and didn't make it into anything more than it was. Behind the observation window, Vanessa had stopped watching the room and was staring at the floor with both hands pressed over her mouth and her eyes shut, doing the particular kind of breathing that people did when they were refusing to come apart in a place where coming apart wasn't on the agenda. The weeks that followed were not a montage. They were not a smooth upward progression of milestones strung together into something that felt inevitable in retrospect. They were hard and uneven and full of sessions where Lila shut down completely, where the new sounds flooding her world hit a threshold she couldn't manage, and she'd press herself into a corner and cover both ears with her palms in a gesture that broke Vanessa's heart every time, because it meant the sounds that were supposed to be gifts had become, temporarily, too much to hold. There was a Tuesday in the 3rd week when she refused to enter the therapy room at all. She sat down in the hallway outside and crossed her arms and looked at the door with an expression of absolute 8-year-old determination, and no amount of coaxing from Nair or Vanessa moved her. Logan arrived 20 minutes late that day because Ethan's carpool had fallen through and he'd had to drive across town himself. He came around the corner and found Lila in the hallway and Vanessa crouched beside her looking frayed at the edges. He looked at the situation. Then he sat down on the hallway floor next to Lila, leaned his back against the wall, stretched his legs out, and pulled his phone from his pocket. "I was thinking," he said, to no one in particular, "that we might skip the room today." Lila looked at him sideways. He pulled up a simple metronome app on his phone and set it on the floor between them. The display pulsed with each beat, a visual rhythm, not just an auditory one. "Ethan's been asking about you," he said, still to the air, not demanding eye contact. "He wants to know if you like fish, the ocean kind. He's been reading about them because he found out you draw them." Lila's expression shifted, still guarded but interested. "He found a book with deep-sea fish in it. Some of them are, honestly, kind of alarming." Logan scrolled briefly on his phone and turned it to show her an image of an anglerfish. "See? That's a real fish. That's an actual thing that lives in the ocean." Lila stared at the anglerfish with the expression of someone who had just discovered that reality was stranger than she'd previously estimated. Then, very slowly, a smile pulled at the corner of her mouth. Not the cautious, testing smile from the conference room. Something more genuine. Something with actual amusement in it. "I know," Logan said. "It's a lot." They sat in the hallway for another 10 minutes. Then Lila picked up the metronome from the floor, examined it, and stood up. She walked to the therapy room door. She looked back at Logan. He stood up and followed her in. Vanessa stayed in the hallway for a moment alone. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and breathed. Then she straightened, smoothed her jacket, and went in after them. "What?" And went in. The board meeting happened on the 42nd day after Lila's surgery, and it was, by Vanessa's own estimation, one of the worst of her professional career. Not because of what the board said, but because of what she did. She had presented a proposal to allocate $12 million from the Whitmore Global Philanthropic Fund toward establishing a dedicated pediatric auditory research initiative, initially structured around the treatment approach Logan had developed with Nair. This was not financially a significant ask. The fund distributed $38 million annually across various initiatives, and $12 million represented a reallocation, not an addition. But the specific application was unusual, and several board members had done their homework. "You're proposing to build a clinical program around a methodology developed by a man who, until 8 weeks ago, was working temporary security for $14 an hour," said the board member seated 4 chairs down from Vanessa. A man named Chester Aldrich, who had been on the Whitmore Global Board for 11 years, and who had, in Vanessa's private estimation, the people skills of a parking meter. "I think the board would be forgiven for asking whether this is a sound strategic allocation or whether this is a personal decision made under emotional circumstances." The room was quiet. Vanessa looked at Aldrich. "Both things can be true," she said. "The decision has an emotional origin. It also has a sound strategic basis, which you've had 2 weeks to review and which Dr. Nair's letter of clinical endorsement addresses in considerable detail. If you'd like to argue the clinical merit, I'm ready to have that conversation. If you'd like to argue that my daughter's experience disqualifies me from making decisions, I'd like to hear you say that more plainly." Aldrich opened his mouth. "More plainly," Vanessa repeated. He closed it. She looked around the table. "Mr. Pierce has experience in applied acoustic signal processing, trauma response under extreme physical conditions, and, as Lila's progress over the past 6 weeks demonstrates, an evidently exceptional instinct for working with children in sensory recovery. The fact that he has been working in temporary employment while raising his son alone is not a data point about his qualifications. It's a data point about the gap between what someone is worth and what the market happened to offer them at a particular moment." She picked up her pen. "Are we voting on the proposal or not?" They voted. The proposal passed 9-3. Vanessa drove home that evening and found Logan's truck parked outside the building, which meant he and Ethan were upstairs with Lila and Mrs. Okafor, the housekeeper who had started leaving extra snacks on the kitchen counter on Wednesdays and Saturdays specifically because a certain 7-year-old had discovered her shortbread and the household had adjusted accordingly. She took the elevator to the penthouse and stood in the entryway for a moment before anyone heard her come in. From the living room, Ethan's voice, narrating something at high speed with the unselfconscious confidence of a child explaining an important topic, the occasional percussion of the small drum. And then, underneath it, quiet, uncertain, but there, the sound of Lila attempting to match a tone with her own voice, a small, effortful, entirely imperfect sound. Vanessa set her bag down on the entry table. She walked to the living room doorway. Lila was sitting on the floor with Earl in her lap, Ethan beside her, and Logan across from them both with the drum. Lila was watching Logan's face and trying to reproduce a sound he'd just made. She wasn't getting it yet. She tried again. Ethan, beside her, tried it too. Badly, on purpose, making a deliberately ridiculous version of it that caused Lila to turn and look at him with an expression of pure 7-year-old collaborative conspiracy. She tried again, still not quite right, but different from the last attempt. Incrementally closer. Vanessa leaned against the doorframe. Logan glanced up and saw her. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her for a moment, taking in whatever he saw in her face, and then looked back at Lila and nodded, encouraging her to try again. Vanessa pulled her phone out and checked the board meeting notes she'd made. 12 million allocated. Program structure approved. Nair confirmed as clinical lead. The operational director position had been discussed but not formally offered. She'd been thinking about that for a while. She looked at the man sitting on her living room floor, patient and present and entirely concentrated on a small girl's imperfect attempts at sound. And she thought about Chester Aldrich's face when she'd asked him to say it plainly. She thought about 11 pages of handwritten methodology notes. She thought about a hospital corridor at 12:47 in the morning and a man pressing his thumb and forefinger to the bridge of his nose. She put her phone away. She would ask him properly. Not tonight. Tonight was for the kids and the drum and whatever sound Lila was working toward with that particular expression of stubborn concentration. But soon. And when she asked, she was going to make sure she said plainly what she meant, because she had spent enough of her life letting important things remain understood rather than spoken. That was a habit she'd decided to break. She asked him on a Thursday morning, 9 days after the board meeting, in the kitchen of the penthouse while Lila was at her weekly occupational therapy appointment and Ethan was at school, and there was no one else in the apartment except Mrs. Okafor, who had the specific gift of making herself absent when the room required it. Vanessa poured coffee, real coffee, not the vending machine variety, and set a mug in front of Logan without asking how he took it, because she'd watched him make it himself 4 times, and she knew. Black, no sugar, drunk while still too hot, in a way that suggested he'd spent years drinking it in conditions where waiting wasn't an option. She sat down across from him. "I want to offer you the director position," she said, formally, with a contract, a salary that reflects what the role actually requires, and full clinical partnership with Dr. Nair. Logan looked at the coffee. "I'm not qualified on paper," he said. "I know. The board already has concerns." The board voted yes. Their concerns are registered and overruled. She folded her hands around her own mug. "I'm not asking you to run a hospital. I'm asking you to lead a program built on a framework you developed. That framework is already producing results that Nair didn't project until week 8. We're at week 6. He looked up. "It's producing early indicators. That's not the same as results." "I know the difference. I've been reading the session notes." "All of them?" "Everyone Nair sends me." She held his gaze. "You write the observation sections." He didn't deny it. "The section from last Tuesday," she said, "where you wrote that Lila had begun self-initiating tactile acoustic pairing without prompting, and that this suggested internal motivation rather than compliance-driven progress." She paused. "That's not security contractor language, Logan." He was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, 40 floors down, the city moved. "My wife," he said finally, "had a traumatic brain injury 3 years before she died." He said it the way people said things they'd practiced saying. Not easily, but with the flatness of repetition, words that had been carried a long time and no longer cut on the way out the same way they once had. She lost a significant portion of her auditory processing, not the same as Lila's situation, but I spent 2 years learning everything I could about how the brain maps and remaps sound. What helps? What doesn't? What the research says versus what actually works in a room with a real person who is exhausted and frightened and has run entirely out of patience for clinical optimism. Vanessa didn't say anything. She waited. "She didn't recover," he said. "Not the auditory processing. Other things came back, her language, most of her motor function, but she never got the hearing back the way it was. And then she died of something unrelated, 14 months later, and I had a 5-year-old and a lot of research notes and nowhere to put any of it." He picked up the coffee. Drank. "Ethan doesn't know most of that," he said. "He knows his mom got sick and died. He doesn't know the specifics." "How old was he?" 5. He remembers her, but not the sick part. That's probably the one thing that went right in that whole period. He set the mug down. "I took the security work because it had flexible hours, and I could be there when he got out of school. That was the whole calculation." Vanessa looked at him across the table. She thought about Chester Aldrich saying the words temporary security and $14 an hour like they were character assessments. She thought about 11 pages of notes built on 2 years of research, driven by watching someone he loved navigate a world that had stopped making sound sense. "Take the job," she said, "not because I need to fill a position, because those children, the ones we're going to reach through the foundation, they need what you know, and you need somewhere to put it." Logan looked at her for a long moment. The salary you're offering, he said. Yes? It's too high. It's the market rate for a clinical program director. I'm not a clinical program director. You will be. She picked up her coffee. Negotiate if you want, but you'll lose. Something moved in his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Ethan's school is across town from the foundation offices. We'll sort the logistics. I'm not moving him mid-year. I'm not asking you to. She looked at him steadily. I have a car service. We'll figure it out. I don't need a car service. Logan. She said his name the way she said things when she was done with the preamble. I'm offering you a position where you can do something that matters, at a scale that will reach children who have no other options, using knowledge you built through one of the hardest experiences of your life. I'm also offering you a salary that means you stop doing math in your head every time Ethan needs new shoes. She set her mug down. What I'm not offering you is an argument about whether you deserve it, because that conversation is over and you weren't at the meeting where I ended it. He looked at the table. Then he looked at her. Okay, he said. Okay, you'll take it? Okay, I'll take it. She nodded once. Good. She stood and picked up her mug. The contracts will be ready Monday. Nair wants you in the session Tuesday morning. Lila's been asking to try the keyboard exercise you mentioned last week. The one with the resonance board? That one. She's been drawing it. She drew a picture of the keyboard and left it on my pillow Tuesday night, which I'm interpreting as a formal request. Logan stood. He stopped. Started again. That's a good sign. Self-initiated communication through visual representation is Logan. She looked at him from the kitchen doorway. You don't have to be clinical about it in here. She drew you a picture and left it on my pillow. You're allowed to just think that's sweet. He looked at her. It's sweet, he said. Yes, she agreed. It is. The resonance board was Logan's design, a flat rectangular panel of medium-density wood with a smooth surface, suspended at the edges by foam gaskets, so that when sound was produced nearby or directly onto it through a speaker positioned beneath it, the vibration traveled through the surface cleanly and consistently. He'd built the prototype himself in his garage over a weekend, with Ethan handing him tools and asking questions about why wood vibrated differently than metal. And Logan had answered each question fully and without condescension because Ethan was 7 and capable of understanding more than most people gave 7-year-olds credit for. He brought it into the therapy room on Tuesday in a canvas bag and set it on the low table without ceremony. Lila was already there, sitting on a floor cushion with Earl, watching the door in the way she'd started watching doors when she knew Logan was coming. Not anxiously, but with the particular quality of attention that meant she'd already decided he was expected and was monitoring for his arrival. She saw the bag. She pointed at it. Yeah, he said, settling onto the floor across from her. That's the thing I told you about. She pointed again, more emphatically. I know, you drew it on paper. Very detailed drawing, by the way. Proportions were pretty accurate. She gave him the flat look she used when she thought he was being slow on purpose. He pulled the resonance board out and set it between them. She leaned forward and pressed both palms against the surface. Nothing was happening yet. It was just wood. She looked up at him. He pulled a small Bluetooth speaker from the bag and connected it to his phone. Okay, he said. I'm going to play something. You tell me. You know how you tell me. He pointed to the board. You tell me what you feel. He started with something low. Not music yet. A single sustained tone at 60 hertz, below the range of most speech, but well within tactile detection threshold. The board vibrated steadily under Lila's hands. Her eyes widened immediately. She pressed harder, trying to get more of it, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She leaned down and pressed her cheek against the board's surface. Dr. Nair, from her corner chair, wrote something and underlined it. Logan let the tone run for 30 seconds, then shifted it up. 80 hertz. The quality of the vibration changed, faster, finer, with a different texture against the skin. Lila lifted her head and looked at her own hands on the board with the expression of someone recalibrating. Different? Logan said. She looked at his mouth, nodded. Higher. She processed that. Then she did something with her hand, a gesture, upward, that she'd apparently just invented to mean the sound went up. Exactly, he said. They worked through the frequency range slowly, pausing at each increment, letting her map the tactile sensation to a concept of pitch that she was building in real time without the auditory reference most people took for granted. It was the kind of work that looked, from outside the room, like almost nothing. A man and a girl sitting at a table with their hands on a piece of wood, and was, in fact, some of the most demanding cognitive construction Logan had ever watched a person do. 40 minutes in, he switched from pure tones to a simple piece of music, a cello piece, because the cello's fundamental frequencies sat in the range Lila's tactile sensitivity was strongest. He didn't announce the change, he just let it happen. Lila felt it immediately. Her whole body shifted. The music had a different character than the tones, complex, layered, moving in time rather than held steady. She closed her eyes, which she'd never done in a session before. Logan watched her face. She was listening, not with her ears, or not primarily with her ears, not yet. She was listening with her hands and her jaw and her collarbone and the surface of the board and some internal translation process. She was assembling piece by piece from scratch, and her face had an expression that Logan had no clinical language for and didn't try to find any, because some things were outside the territory where clinical language was useful. He let the piece play to its end. The room was quiet. Lila opened her eyes. She looked at him. Then she did something she'd never done in a session before. She picked up Earl, held the stuffed elephant against the surface of the resonance board, and looked at Logan with an expression that clearly meant, "Does Earl feel it too?" Logan reached over and tapped the board twice. The vibration traveled through the wood to the elephant's stuffed body against the surface. Lila looked at the elephant for a long moment. Then she looked at Logan and made the gesture she'd invented for hire, hand moving upward, and then made a new gesture, one he hadn't seen before, both hands spreading outward from the center, like something expanding. He thought about that for a second. "Bigger?" he said. "The sound got bigger?" She pointed at him. "Yes. That's what a melody does," he said. "It moves and it opens up, yeah." She looked at the board. Then she pressed her palm flat on it and held it there even though the music was done. Just holding. He let her. The legal proceedings against Clara Devins and the unlicensed specialist, who had been operating under the name Dr. Marcus Webb, though the investigative firm found no evidence of any legitimate medical degree attached to that name or any of his others, began 6 weeks after the private investigation concluded and moved faster than most civil matters, because Vanessa Whitmore had 3 things that civil proceedings responded well to: documented evidence, an excellent legal team, and the kind of focused institutional anger that does not return calls unreturned or emails unanswered or motions unfiled. She did not discuss the proceedings with Logan in detail. He knew they were happening. She'd told him the broad outline. But the specifics were between her and her attorneys, and she was careful about the boundary, not because she didn't trust him, but because she had learned a long time ago that carrying legal rage into personal spaces contaminated them, and the spaces where Logan and Lila and Ethan existed had become, quietly and without a formal announcement, personal. What she did tell him on a Saturday evening in late November while Ethan and Lila were watching something on a tablet in the living room, and she and Logan were sitting at the kitchen island with the remnants of dinner between them, was this: they're both going to settle. Webb's attorneys made contact last week. Devins already agreed in principle. The financial terms are still being negotiated, but it's going to resolve before it goes to trial. Logan looked at his water glass. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel like a trial would take 2 more years and put Lila in a position where her medical history becomes a matter of public record in a way I can't fully control," she said. "And I feel like that's not worth whatever satisfaction I'd get from watching them answer questions in a courtroom. That's a practical position. It's the only position I can afford. Is it the one you want?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "The one I want involves significantly more consequences and considerably less settlement negotiation. But what I want isn't the governing factor here. Lila is. Lila is." From the living room, Ethan's voice. "Lila, look at this one. It's the anglerfish again." A sound followed that was new and was still new enough that both adults stopped when they heard it. Not a word. Not speech. Just Lila's voice making a sound that was recognizably a response. A short, surprised exclamation at whatever Ethan was showing her, involuntary and unplanned and completely unself-conscious. The kind of sound you made when something caught you off guard before you had time to be aware you were making it. Lila had been making sounds for 3 weeks, mostly in sessions, carefully, with Logan or Nair guiding her. Occasionally at home, when she forgot she was being cautious about it. This was the first time she'd done it in reaction to something Ethan said. The first time sound had come out of her in direct social response, the way it did for people who'd been doing it their whole lives without thinking. Vanessa set down her glass. Logan didn't move. From the living room, Ethan's voice again. "Did you just... Hey, you made a noise." A pause. "Do it again." Silence. "Come on, I heard it. Do it again." Another silence. Then, small, reluctant, mortified in the specific way of a child who has been asked to perform something they did accidentally, a small sound. Lila's voice, 3 notes of an unintentional melody, gone in a second. Ethan erupted with the kind of approval that only a 7-year-old could produce without any self-consciousness whatsoever. Pure volume, pure enthusiasm, absolute in its sincerity. "I heard that. Dad, she did it. Did you hear?" Logan called back. "I heard. She made a noise like a song." Vanessa stood up from the kitchen island and walked out of the room quietly, down the hallway, into the small bathroom near the guest room, where she turned on the tap and stood with her hands on either side of the sink and looked at her own face in the mirror for approximately 90 seconds. Then she turned off the tap, dried her hands, and went back to the kitchen. Logan had moved to the doorway of the living room. He was leaning against the frame, watching the 2 kids on the couch. Lila had Earl pressed against her face, hiding from Ethan's continued enthusiastic commentary, which only encouraged him. He heard Vanessa come up behind him. He didn't turn around. "She's been holding back in the sessions," he said quietly. "I thought so. She was doing better than she was showing Nair and me. She was waiting until she was ready." "She's 8, Vanessa said. "She's been managing what people see her do for 6 years. "Yeah." He watched Lila lower Earl from her face and look at Ethan with the specific expression she used when he was being impossible, and she was deciding whether to be annoyed or charmed by it. "She's cautious. She's been cautious her whole life. That's not going to change overnight." "Will it change?" He thought about the question honestly, which meant he was quiet for a moment before answering. "The caution? Probably not entirely, but the reason for it will change. That's actually what you want. You don't want a kid who isn't cautious. You want a kid who's cautious because it serves her, not because she's afraid." Vanessa was quiet beside him. "Where'd you learn to think about it like that?" she said. "Ethan," he said. "He was really shy when he was 5, after his mom died. He'd go quiet in situations where he didn't feel safe. I kept trying to draw him out, and it kept not working, and finally his teacher, this small, patient, completely no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Ellison, told me I had to stop treating his silence like a problem and start treating it like communication." He paused. "So I did, and he stopped being silent." "When?" "About 6 months later, gradually. And then one day I realized he hadn't stopped talking for 3 hours, and I wasn't sure when exactly that had happened." Vanessa looked at Ethan, who was currently narrating the evolutionary history of the anglerfish to Lila with all the authority of someone who had read one book about it. "He's a good kid," she said. "He's a handful," Logan said. "But yeah." The board's discomfort with Logan's appointment, which Chester Aldrich had made a point of registering formally in the meeting minutes, did not go away after the vote. It went quiet, which was different, and in Vanessa's experience more operationally dangerous. And then it resurfaced 6 weeks into the program's operational launch, in a way that was, technically, legal and professionally within the board's purview, and calculated to be both those things. What Aldrich brought to the November board meeting was a request for an independent external audit of the Foundation's program structure and a formal review of Logan's professional qualifications and their alignment with the director role's stated requirements, framed neutrally as a standard governance procedure. Filed 3 days before the meeting, so Vanessa had minimum preparation time. She walked into that meeting knowing exactly what it was. She sat down at the head of the table, set her folder in front of her, and looked at Aldrich with the expression she reserved for situations where she had decided that being civil was no longer the efficient choice. "Before we begin," she said, "I want to make sure everyone in this room understands what we're about to spend the next hour discussing." She opened the folder. "In the 6 weeks since the Foundation's program launch, we have enrolled 14 children in the pilot cohort. 11 of those children have no prior treatment options available to them through existing medical channels. Their families have been told, by credentialed specialists, that meaningful hearing recovery is not achievable. In 6 weeks, 9 of those 11 have shown measurable acoustic mapping progress. She looked up. 3 of those 9 are children whose families have been waiting for this result for longer than Lila did. So when you bring an external audit request that is designed to slow or disrupt the program, I want you to understand precisely what you're proposing to slow. Aldrich kept his expression neutral. The board has a fiduciary responsibility to— I know what the board's fiduciary responsibility is, Vanessa said. I've been managing it for 5 years. The audit request as filed has no procedural basis. We've had no complaints, no compliance issues, and no financial irregularities. It's a qualification challenge dressed in governance language, and everyone at this table knows it. She looked around the room. If the board has specific concerns about Mr. Pierce's qualifications, I invite those concerns to be stated plainly. I've asked him to be available by phone this morning in case specific questions arise. A board member named Sandra Kwan, who sat 3 seats from Aldrich and had voted yes on the program, looked up. You want him on the phone during a board meeting? I want the people asking questions about him to have the opportunity to ask those questions directly, Vanessa said, rather than through a governance mechanism that he can't respond to. The room was quiet for a moment. Aldrich said, That's highly irregular. Yes, Vanessa agreed. It is. She picked up her phone. Should I call him? Patet. She called him. Logan answered on the second ring, which meant he was already waiting. She told him the night before that it might happen, but hadn't been certain, and she registered again the way he handled uncertainty, not by filling it with words, but by staying available. She put the phone on speaker on the conference table. Mr. Pierce, Aldrich began, the board's concern is straightforward. The director role for a clinical program of this scope typically requires advanced medical or audiology credentials. Your background is military. Can you explain to the board why you believe your experience qualifies you for this position? A brief pause from the speaker. Sure, Logan said. My last operational posting was as the team leader of a 6-person naval special warfare unit conducting rescue and recovery operations in high-noise environments. Part of my qualification for that role involved 8 months of intensive training in bone conduction communication systems and acoustic signal management, how to transmit and receive meaningful information through physical vibration when conventional auditory channels are compromised. I also spent 2 years as a primary caregiver for a person with acquired auditory processing disorder, during which time I independently studied the current clinical literature on cortical remapping and developed familiarity with the methodologies Dr. Nair has since endorsed and incorporated into our program. Another pause. I'm also the person who noticed the device in Lila Sterling's ear when 13 credentialed specialists had not over 6 years of examination. I don't say that to be difficult. I say it because the board appears to be treating credentials as a proxy for competence, and I want to be clear that in this specific domain, those two things are not the same. Silence around the conference table. Furthermore, Logan continued, the children currently enrolled in this program are not there because of my credentials. They're there because their families had run out of options, and Dr. Nair, who does have credentials, reviewed my methodology and found it clinically sound. If the board wants to audit my work, I'll make everything available. Session notes, progress assessments, methodology documentation. But I'd ask that the audit happen quickly, because there are 14 kids in this program and their therapy schedules don't pause for governance reviews. Another silence. Sandra Kwan said, I'm satisfied. Aldrich said nothing. Vanessa looked at the phone. Thank you, Logan. Sure, he said, and hung up. The audit request was tabled, not withdrawn. Aldrich was too careful for a full withdrawal, but tabled indefinitely, which was the closest thing to a concession the man was capable of. Vanessa collected her folder and called a 5-minute break. She walked to the window at the end of the conference room and looked out at the city for a moment. The sky was the specific flat gray of late November that made everything look permanent. She thought about Logan sitting somewhere with his phone, having just spoken to a roomful of skeptical board members with the same unraised voice he used when he was sitting on the floor of a therapy room tapping a drum. She thought about 2 years of research built out of grief, 11 pages of notes, a $15 drum from a music store. A board hearing he'd prepared for by simply deciding to tell the truth. She thought about what it cost, consistently, to be the kind of person who just told the truth. She turned from the window and went back to the table. December came, and with it the particular quality of exhaustion that arrived at the end of a year that had required more of everyone than they'd budgeted for. Lila's progress was real and documented, and by any clinical measure, ahead of projection. She was producing intentional sounds 3 to 4 times per session. She had learned 6 consistent vocalizations that she used communicatively. Not words yet, but sounds with reliable meaning, sounds that Ethan had memorized and responded to as fluently as speech, in the way that children absorbed each other's languages without effort or announcement. She still had nightmares sometimes. She still covered her ears in loud spaces. She still pressed her palms against surfaces when she was anxious, grounding herself in vibration the way she always had, because some habits were load-bearing and you didn't dismantle them just because the circumstances that built them had changed. What was changing was smaller, and therefore more real. The way she sat in the therapy room now versus the way she'd sat in October, the difference in her posture, the degree to which her shoulders were down instead of braced, the way she looked at Logan when she got something right, not with relief, the way she'd looked at the beginning, but with a kind of quiet satisfaction that didn't need external validation. Leaving the last shortbread from the kitchen plate for Ethan without being asked, because she'd noticed he always looked for a second one. Logan noticed all of it. He noticed it the way he'd been trained to notice everything that mattered in a space where missing details was consequential. And then he noticed himself noticing, and he filed that away with the other things he'd been filing away for the past several months. The things that were not about Lila or the program or anything clinical at all, but were about the woman who sat across from him at a kitchen island and answered questions honestly, even when the honest answer was not the comfortable one. He didn't do anything with what he noticed. Not yet. He was by nature and by practice a patient man, patient in the way that people who had learned to wait for the right moment because the wrong moment cost lives tended to be patient. He understood that some things required time, not because they weren't certain, but because certainty without timing was just intention, and intention without action was just noise. He was waiting for the right moment. On the last Thursday before the holiday break, he arrived at the penthouse for a session to find Lila already at the resonance board, both palms flat on the surface, waiting. She looked up when he came in. She pointed to the board. Then she pointed to herself. Then she made the gesture she'd invented for higher, hand moving upward. He stopped in the doorway. "You want to try something higher?" he said. She pointed to herself again, more firmly. As she was saying, "Me, I want to try something. You want to do something," he said. "On the board, by yourself." She nodded. He walked over slowly and sat down across from the board, leaving her space on her side of it. He didn't touch the speaker, didn't set up the phone. He just sat and waited. Lila looked at the board for a long moment. Then she leaned down, the way she had on that first session day, and pressed her lips very lightly against the surface. And she hummed. It was not a melody. It was not even quite a note. It was somewhere between a note and a sustained breath, imprecise and wavering, and completely without the self-consciousness that had characterized every sound she'd made since the beginning. It was a child testing something privately, the way children tested things they weren't sure about, not for an audience, not for approval, but to know for themselves. The board vibrated under her lips. She felt it. She pressed a little harder. The sound changed, steadier, slightly fuller. She lifted her head. She looked at Logan. He held very still. His face was neutral in the specific way it went neutral when he was making a deliberate choice about what to show, because the alternative was something he didn't have language for and wasn't prepared to put in the room. "That was yours," he said quietly. "That sound, that was yours." She looked at him. Then she looked at the board. Then she pressed her palm to the surface one more time, flat and steady, and held it there. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle, the way December light did, laying itself across the floor in a long, pale stripe. Mrs. Okafor was somewhere in the apartment being quiet. Somewhere across the city, Ethan was finishing a school day and would arrive in an hour with opinions about the anglerfish and requests for shortbread. The resonance board sat between them, still, carrying nothing now except the memory of a sound that an 8-year-old girl had made entirely for herself, for no reason except to find out what it felt like to let the world hear her. Logan Pierce sat across from her in the December light and thought about what it meant to be present for a moment that wasn't yours to claim, but that you'd been trusted enough to witness. And he thought about how rare that was. And he thought about how it was possible to spend years putting yourself in harm's way for reasons that felt large and important, and come away from all of it and discover that the thing that finally cracked you open was a child pressing her mouth against a piece of wood and humming. He didn't say any of that. He just stayed. The holiday break lasted 11 days, and Logan spent most of it doing the things single fathers did during school holidays, making meals that Ethan ate approximately 60% of, losing 2 consecutive games of checkers to a 7-year-old who had apparently developed a strategy, and fixing the kitchen cabinet hinge that had been loose since September, and that he'd been stepping around for so long it had become invisible to him. Ethan asked, on the 3rd day, whether they were going to see Lila. "Not until after New Year's," Logan said. "She's with her mom." "I know she's with her mom. I meant, are we going to see both of them?" Logan looked at him. "Since when do you call Vanessa both of them?" Ethan shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a child who had already thought about this more than he was prepared to admit. "She's always there when we're there. It's her apartment." "I know, He moved a checker piece. "Lila showed me something before break, on her communication cards. She has a card that's like a house, right? And she pointed to it and then pointed to me and then pointed to herself." He looked up. "What does that mean?" Logan was quiet for a moment. "What do you think it means?" Ethan considered this with the gravity he brought to things he'd already considered. "I think it means she thinks of where we live as the same place, like the same category." He moved another checker. "Your move." Logan moved a piece without really seeing the board. "That'd be something," Ethan said, neutrally, examining the board. "Yeah," Logan said, "it would." That was the whole conversation. Ethan won the game 4 minutes later and went to find something to watch. And Logan sat at the kitchen table with the checker pieces still on the board and thought about a 7-year-old's understanding of what a house card meant, and whether children were better than adults at simply identifying what was true without requiring the full weight of context to do it. He called Vanessa that evening. Not about anything specific, just a call. She answered while sounding like she was in the middle of reading something and didn't put it down, and they talked for 40 minutes about the pilot program's December data and Nair's recommendation to expand the cohort in February, and a grant opportunity that Vanessa's legal team had flagged, and the fact that Ethan had apparently been texting Lila through Vanessa's phone using pictures because neither child had their own device, a development that both parents had discovered simultaneously, and neither had stopped because it was, practically speaking, the most communication Lila had initiated with anyone outside the household all month. When the practical topics ran out, there was a pause that was not uncomfortable, which Logan noticed because uncomfortable silences had been his baseline expectation for most of his adult life, and the fact that this one wasn't said something he wasn't ready to say aloud. "How's the holiday been?" Vanessa asked. Her voice had dropped into the register it used when the professional framing was off, and she was just talking. "Quiet," he said. "Good quiet. Ethan beat me at checkers." Was he smug about it? Diplomatic, which was somehow worse. She laughed. A real one, not the polished social version, but the short, unguarded kind that people produced when something caught them before they could manage it. "Lila has been drawing constantly," she said. "She drew the resonance board again, and then she drew you sitting across from it." He didn't respond immediately. "She got the posture right," Vanessa added. "The way you sit cross-legged with your elbows on your knees. She's observant." "She's been observant her whole life. She had to be." A pause. "She drew me next to you. In the picture." Another pause, shorter. "Standing beside, not behind." She was very deliberate about the placement. Logan looked at the checkerboard on his kitchen table. "Vanessa, I'm not making it into anything," she said. "I'm just telling you what she drew." "Okay." "Okay," she said. They stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes after that, talking about nothing important, and when they hung up, Logan sat in his kitchen in the particular stillness of a house where a child is asleep and everything is quiet, and there is finally space to think about things that daylight hours don't have room for. He thought about them for a while. Then he went to bed. January arrived the way January did. gray and declarative, making no apologies for the fact that December was over. The Foundation's program reopened the second week of the month, and the expanded cohort Dr. Nair had proposed was approved with 6 new children added to the pilot, ages 5 through 11, varying degrees of residual auditory function, all of them referred through the network of pediatric audiologists that Vanessa had begun quietly cultivating since October. Logan sat in on the intake assessments for each new child, which was not technically part of his role, but which Nair had stopped questioning because his read on a child's readiness and receptivity was consistently more accurate than the standard assessment battery. He didn't interfere with Nair's clinical process. He sat slightly outside the main interaction, off to the side, and watched. There was a 5-year-old named Marcus who shut down completely at the sight of the audiometry equipment because he'd had too many unpleasant experiences with it, and who did not shut down when Logan slid the resonance board across the table to him without explanation and let him touch it. There was a 9-year-old named Sophie who communicated primarily in written notes she prepared in advance, which she handed to adults with the formality of a small person who had decided that if the world was going to be difficult about her hearing, she was going to be organized about it. There was an 11-year-old named Darius who was furious in the specific way of older children who had spent years watching younger kids get more accommodation and more patience from the adults around them, and who responded to Logan addressing him without simplification or apology with the particular suspicion of someone who was waiting for the catch. There was no catch. Logan just talked to him like a person and let him be as difficult as he needed to be. "You're not going to tell me it gets easier?" Darius said during their second session, when the question came out before he could stop it, and he immediately looked like he regretted it. Logan thought about whether to be honest or reassuring, and chose honest. "Some of it gets easier, some of it just gets different. But you build more tools, and the tools start to feel like yours instead of like things other people made you carry." Darius looked at the resonance board. "What if I don't want more tools? What if I just want it to work?" "Yeah," Logan said. "That's fair." He didn't offer anything more than that because there wasn't anything more that was true. They sat in silence for a minute. Then Darius pressed his palm against the resonance board. He didn't ask. He just did it. Logan started the tone sequence without making anything of it. Lila's first real word, not a vocalization, not an approximation, but a word, happened on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of January at 3:17 in the afternoon, and it happened without warning or ceremony or any of the preparatory context that might have allowed the people in the room to brace for it. They had been working for 45 minutes on what Nair called acoustic anchoring, Logan producing a clear, consistent sound, while Lila tracked it with both the resonance board and her own voice, building the neural connection between acoustic input and vocal output that was the prerequisite for meaningful speech. It was painstaking work. Some days it produced visible progress. Some days it produced nothing except fatigue, and Lila would end the session with her chin tucked and her hands in her lap, and the expression of someone who had worked very hard at something that hadn't moved. That day she'd been at the edge of the fatigue threshold for the last 10 minutes. Logan could see it. Nair could see it. They were approaching the natural end of the session. He was about to start the wind-down sequence when Lila did something she hadn't done before. She put both her hands against her throat, not self-consciously. Not as a therapeutic exercise, just hands against throat, feeling for her own vibration the way he'd taught her to feel for vibration in the board. She'd taught herself to transfer the principle. He went still. She pressed her lips together. He could see her doing internally what she always did in sessions, organizing, preparing, choosing, except it was happening faster than usual, more urgently, like something had risen close enough to the surface that it was either coming out now or not at all. Nair's pen stopped. Lila pushed air forward from her diaphragm. He could see it in her posture, the small gathering of effort, and opened her mouth. The first attempt produced no sound, just breath. She tried again. This time something came, a thin, effortful sound, the consonant and vowel pressing against each other unevenly, the whole thing lasting less than half a second. But it was shaped. It was aimed at something. She looked directly at the observation window, at her mother. She tried again. The sound was clearer this time, 2 distinct syllables, imperfect, the vowel slightly off, but unmistakably organized around a real word, the word she'd chosen, out of everything, for this moment. Not because it was the easiest or the most practiced, but because it was the one that mattered. Mom. It was barely above a whisper. It was shaped wrong at the edges. The M was held too long and the vowel slid downward in a way that no one who'd spoken their whole life would produce it. It was the most complete sound in the room. In the observation area behind the glass, Vanessa Whitmore made a sound of her own. Involuntary, strangled, the sound of something breaking that had been held together through sheer structural will for a very long time. She pressed both hands against the glass, not reaching, not able to reach, just needing contact with the surface that separated her from her daughter. In the therapy room, Logan did not move. He did not speak. He looked at Lila. She was watching him, waiting. Not for approval. She'd moved past needing his approval to tell her whether she'd done something real. She was watching to see what it meant that she'd done it, how he understood it. He nodded. Just once. Slow and definite. She exhaled. The tension in her shoulders dropped 2 full inches. Behind the glass, Vanessa was on her knees. Logan couldn't see her, but Nair could from her seat angle, and he saw it in Nair's face, the doctor who had spent 4 years certain of what Lila could not do, and who was now sitting 3 feet from the evidence of everything she'd missed. Nair was not crying. She was doing the thing clinicians trained themselves to do when they were going to cry. Sitting very still, breathing evenly, keeping the professional exterior in place through the specific controlled effort of someone who understood that this moment was not about them. Lila, in the therapy room, looked at her hands on her throat. Then she pressed the resonance board surface with one palm, then her throat again. She was mapping it, connecting the vibration in the board to the vibration she'd just produced in herself, filing it, understanding that they were the same principle at different scales. She'd built that connection herself, in real time. Logan stayed on the floor until she was done mapping. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out the $15 drum. He set it between them. He tapped once. She tapped back. He tapped twice. She tapped back. Then she put her hands on her throat and made the sound again, clearer this time, still imperfect, but clearer. "Mom," she said, and then she looked at the observation window. Vanessa did not come into the therapy room immediately. She needed 3 minutes in the corridor first, 3 minutes that she spent with her back against the wall and her hands over her face, doing nothing organized or controlled or Whitmore appropriate. She cried in the way people cried when they'd been holding something for so long that when it finally let go, the whole body was involved. Not elegant, not quiet, full of the specific gracelessness of real grief releasing. Marcus, her security director, who had been with her for 4 years and who had seen her through things that most people never saw anyone through, stood at the end of the corridor and did not approach and did not look away. Because he'd learned that what she needed in those moments was simply someone present who wasn't going to make her perform composure before she had it back. After 3 minutes, she straightened. She pressed her fingertips under her eyes. She breathed. Then she walked to the therapy room door and opened it. Lila turned. For a moment, just a moment, neither of them moved. Then Lila crossed the room in 4 steps and put her arms around her mother's waist, the way she always did, the way she'd done her whole life, the physical language that had been their primary vocabulary since before Lila had any other kind. Vanessa held her daughter and did not say anything, because there was nothing she could say that would be equal to the moment, and she was wise enough finally to know that. Lila pulled back after a minute. She looked up at her mother's face. She raised one hand and touched her own throat. Then she said it again. "Mom." Vanessa made a sound that was not a word. She pulled Lila back in and held her and pressed her cheek against the top of her daughter's head and stayed there. Across the room, Dr. Nair was writing in her notebook with the focus of someone who needed to have her hands doing something specific. Logan was sitting on the floor with the drum in his lap, and he was looking at the window, at the city through the glass, gray-skied and January bare. And his face was the face of a man who had carried something a long way and had just, without fanfare, been allowed to set it down. The media found out 6 weeks later. Not through Vanessa. She'd been careful, more careful than the situation probably required, because she'd learned early that visibility was a tool that cut both directions. But one of the other families in the pilot cohort spoke to a journalist, off the record, and then on the record, and the journalist was good at their job and pulled the thread until it unraveled into a story that ran in a Sunday health supplement under the headline, "The Girl Who Heard Her Mother's Voice." Vanessa read the headline on her phone at 6 in the morning and called her PR director before 7. How bad? She said. It's not bad, her PR director said. That's the thing. The piece is good. It's sympathetic, and the clinical framing is solid, and the family they interviewed said everything right. The problem isn't the article. Then what's the problem? It's already been picked up by 4 national outlets, and it's trending. A pause. People want to know about the security guard. Vanessa was quiet. The headline in the second pickup, her director said carefully, is Billionaire's Daughter Cured by Security Guard, which is not accurate on multiple levels, but is going to be very difficult to walk back once it's the frame. Logan's not going to want, I know, but his name is in the original piece. It's already out there. She hung up and called Logan. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd already seen it. I didn't give them anything, he said immediately. I know. I'm not calling about that. She paused. How are you? A beat. Ethan's school called. His teacher saw the article and wanted to make sure he was okay. He's fine. He didn't know his dad was in the news until his teacher told him. Another beat. He thought it was pretty cool. Are you okay? Longer pause. I don't love it, he said. The security guard framing, not because of the security guard part. I don't care about that. But because it makes it sound like I did something miraculous and singular, and what I actually did was notice one thing and then show up consistently for the next 4 months. Those aren't the same story. I know. The kids in the program, all 14 of them, their progress isn't because of me. It's because of the methodology and Nair, and because they worked incredibly hard in situations that were genuinely frightening. That's the story, not whatever the headline is. You want to talk to the journalist? No. Immediate. I don't want to talk to anyone. A pause. But if we don't say something, the frame stays. I'll handle it, Vanessa said. I'll do a statement through the foundation that centers the clinical team and the families. Your name stays in it. It has to. It's accurate. But the frame shifts. You don't have to. Logan, this is what I do. She said it without impatience, plainly. Let me do it. He was quiet for a moment. Okay. The board is going to use this, she said. Aldrich specifically. The visibility changes the calculus. How? Because now it becomes harder to quietly dismantle something that the public thinks is working, which is a double-edged problem. We get protection from the visibility, but we also get scrutiny, and scrutiny means everyone looks harder at the parts that aren't finished yet. She paused. I want you to know that before it happens. It was already going to happen, he said. Programs like this get reviewed when they're working. That's not a threat, it's just how institutions operate. You're very calm about this. I've been in situations where being calm was the only available option for long enough that it became a habit. A pause. Also, Ethan is currently eating cereal and explaining to me why anglerfish would be good pets. And it's hard to be catastrophizing about media coverage and maintaining that conversation at the same time. Vanessa stood at her kitchen window. The city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of people who had no idea what was happening in a small therapy room in a private rehabilitation center where a girl had pressed her hands to her throat and said a word for the first time. He'd want a saltwater tank, she said. He already priced one out, 42 gallons. He showed me the website. Lila would draw the fish, and she would absolutely draw the fish. There was a brief silence that wasn't about any of the things they'd just discussed. I'll have the statement ready by noon, Vanessa said. Okay, Logan said. Thank you. She hung up and looked at her phone. Then she opened a new document and started writing. Ma'am. The statement did what it was meant to do, shifted the frame without correcting it so aggressively that the correction became the story. And the media cycle moved on within a week the way media cycles did, chasing the next piece of forward motion. What it left behind was a waiting list. By the end of January, the foundation had received 412 inquiries from families across the country and 37 from internationally. Parents who had read the article, parents who had been told the same things Vanessa had been told, parents who had been carrying the same certain impossibility for years, and who had read about a $15 drum and a resonance board and a health supplement, and had written emails that Logan read in his office on a Thursday afternoon and could not get through without stopping several times. He was stopped on the 12th email when Vanessa appeared in his office doorway. She looked at him. How many have you read? 12? How many are there? 412. She came in and sat down in the chair across from his desk. She'd brought 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the foundation's kitchen, which was not the coffee from her penthouse, but which was considerably better than hospital vending machine coffee, and which had become, over the months, the coffee they drank when they were at the foundation working late. She set 1 cup in front of him. He looked at it, then at her. "We can't respond to 412 families with the current staff," he said. "No. We can expand the cohort, but the physical space limits us to, I know. Which means we need to think about training other clinicians in the methodology. Which means documentation, certification protocols, supervision structures. I know," she said again. "I've been thinking about it since this morning." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've also been on the phone with 2 hospital systems that want to discuss licensing the methodology for their pediatric audiology departments." He looked at her. "Hospital systems," he said. "Large ones, both with existing pediatric audiology infrastructure. The methodology would need to be formalized for clinical training. Nair is already working on the documentation. But if it can be licensed and taught to practicing audiologists, we're not limited by our physical footprint." Logan was quiet for a moment. "That changes what we are." "Yes. We stop being a small pilot program and start being a framework," she said, "that other people can use." He looked at the stack of emails on his desk. 12 of them, and he'd had to stop. 300 more waiting. "That's what you've been thinking about since this morning," he said. "That and other things." She picked up her coffee. "But primarily that." He looked at her over the cup. She was wearing the specific expression she wore when she'd already made most of a decision and was waiting to see whether the other person arrived at the same place independently or needed more information. He'd learned to recognize it. "What are the other things?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she set her coffee down. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about the fact that Lila asked me last week whether you and Ethan were going to be at the apartment for her birthday. Her birthday is in March. I know. That's 2 months away. I know." She looked at her hands around the cup. She didn't ask it the way she asks about appointments or sessions. She asked it the way she asks about things she's already counted on and needs confirmed. A pause. "She's never done that with anyone except Mrs. Okafor. And me." Logan was quiet. "I'm not," Vanessa started again. "I'm not telling you that to put pressure on anything. I'm telling you because I think you should know, and because I've spent the last several months trying to stop letting important things go unsaid." She looked up. "That was a habit I had, the unsaid things. I'm trying to break it." "I remember you saying that," he said. "A while ago." "It takes longer than a while." She held his gaze. "I'm also not only telling you because of Lila." The office was quiet. Down the hall, one of the clinical assistants was on a phone call, voice muffled by the closed door. The coffee machine in the kitchen made a sound and then stopped. Logan leaned forward, elbows on the desk, and looked at her directly. The full attention he usually reserved for things that required it, the quality of focus that meant he'd cleared everything else from the room. "What are you telling me?" he said. She held his gaze. "I'm telling you that whatever this is, the foundation, the work, Lila, Ethan, the phone calls that stop being about work, the fact that my kitchen table has become the place where I actually think instead of the place where I review documents. I don't think it's something I want to treat carefully enough to lose." She paused. "And I'm telling you that because I mean it, and because I've learned the difference between letting something be understood and actually saying it." He looked at her for a long moment. "I've been waiting," he said, "for the right moment to say the same thing." And this is a pretty good one." Something in her face moved. Not relief exactly, but the release of a tension that had been maintained for a very long time. The way a structure relaxed when the load it had been built to carry was finally, carefully, shared. She picked up her coffee. "The hospital systems want a meeting next Thursday," she said. "I'd like you there." "I'll be there." "And Lila's birthday is March 15th. "I know when her birthday is," he said. "I already asked Ethan what she wanted." Vanessa stopped. "You asked Ethan?" "He has better intelligence than I do. He's been texting her in pictures for 2 months. He looked at the emails on his desk. "She wants a fish." "Of course she does." "A real one. Small tank, fresh water, something that doesn't require 42 gallons. Vanessa looked at him across the desk with the coffee cup in her hands and the late afternoon light coming in through the office window, laying itself across the floor between them. And she thought about a corridor in Whitmore Global Tower and a man crouching down with his palms raised and the specific quality of attention he'd brought to her daughter in the 30 seconds before she understood what he was. She thought about how long it took to trust someone all the way through, how the accumulation of small proofs was sometimes the only kind that counted, how you couldn't rush it without losing it, and how some things required you to simply wait until the waiting was done. She thought the waiting was done. "A small freshwater tank," she said. "Lila will draw every fish in it." Probably the same fish, repeatedly. She's committed to her subjects. She is. He looked at the emails, then back at her. "I'll read the rest of these tonight." "Not all of them tonight." "Some of them," he said. "Enough." She stood. "I'll have the hospital meeting confirmed by tomorrow." She picked up both coffee cups to take them back to the kitchen. Then she stopped in the doorway. "Logan." He looked up. "Thank you," she said. "For the corridor. For noticing." He looked at her. "I was just doing the job." "No," she said. "You weren't." And she left him with the emails and the afternoon light and the particular quiet of a moment that had been a long time arriving and had, when it finally came, been simple enough to fit in a sentence. He pulled his next email toward him and started reading. Outside the office window, the city continued its indifferent motion. Somewhere across town, in a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a resonance board on the living room table and a stuffed elephant named Earl on the couch, an 8-year-old girl was pressing her palm to the window glass and feeling for vibrations in a world that was getting louder every day, learning it inch by inch, sound by sound, in the patient and stubborn and entirely her own way. And in a small office in a foundation that was about to become something larger than either of its founders had planned for, a man read other people's impossible stories and let himself be affected by every single one, because the alternative was not feeling them, and he had learned, at some cost and over considerable time, that not feeling things was not the same as being strong. It was just a different kind of damage. He read until the light changed, and then he kept reading. March arrived the way it always did in the city. Not cleanly, not with the decisive warmth that people hoped for after a long winter, but in fits and starts, one warm day followed by 3 cold ones, the light changing before the temperature did, arriving earlier each morning by increments so small you only noticed them in aggregate, the kind of change that happened whether you were paying attention or not. Lila Sterling turned 9 on the 15th, and the birthday party was not the kind of birthday party that Vanessa had thrown in previous years. The catered affairs in the penthouse with coordinated decorations and carefully curated guest lists of children from appropriate families, parties that Lila had endured rather than enjoyed, moving through them with Earl pressed against her chest and her eyes tracking the room for Logan, who in previous years had not existed and whose absence she had felt as a shapeless, unnamed thing she had no language for. This year, there were 7 children, the 6 who had become Lila's tentative, genuine friends through the Foundation's expanding family network, and Ethan, who arrived first and immediately began rearranging the furniture in the living room for reasons he explained at length to Mrs. Okafor, who listened with the patient expression of a woman who had decided, sometime in November, that this particular 7-year-old was simply part of the household now. The fish tank was set up in Lila's room 2 days before the party. A 20-gallon freshwater setup with smooth river stones and a small piece of driftwood and 3 fish that the pet store owner had described as good beginner fish and that Ethan had researched extensively and approved. Lila stood in front of it for 45 minutes the morning it was installed, pressing her palm against the glass, feeling the vibration of the filter pump, watching the fish move through water that caught the morning light and broke it into small shifting pieces. She named them. Not with cards this time, not with gestures. She pressed her hands against her throat and said them. 3 names. Imperfect. The consonants landing slightly wrong, the vowels not quite where a speech therapist would put them, but organized and intentional, and hers. Logan was standing in the doorway when she did it. He'd brought the tank over early with Ethan's help, and they'd spent an hour setting it up, and he'd been on his way out when he heard her. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't know he was there. She was talking to the fish, actually talking, low and unhurried, the words not clear enough yet to be understood across a room, but present, continuous. A girl in private conversation with 3 small fish in a tank on her dresser, doing the thing that had been taken from her before she was old enough to know it was being taken. Logan stood in the doorway and did not move for a long time. Then he walked quietly back down the hallway to the kitchen, where Vanessa was on the phone with the foundation's operations director, and Ethan was eating cereal at the counter. He sat down on one of the counter stools. Ethan looked at him. "She's talking to the fish," Ethan said. "Yeah," Logan said. "She's been in there a while." "Yeah." Ethan ate a spoonful of cereal. "Is that good?" Logan looked at his son, this 7-year-old person who had handed him tools in a garage and researched anglerfish and waved hello to a stranger's daughter and absorbed an entirely new family configuration with the flexibility of someone for whom love was not a finite resource to be protected, but simply a thing that expanded to fit what was needed. "That's very good," Logan said. Ethan nodded, satisfied, and went back to his cereal. The legal case against Clara Devins and the man who had operated as Marcus Webb concluded in February, 2 weeks before Lila's birthday, with a civil settlement whose specific terms were sealed by mutual agreement of both parties. What was not sealed, because Vanessa's attorneys had been very deliberate about this, was the matter of public record confirming that a fraudulent medical practice had resulted in documented harm to a minor, a record that existed and would exist regardless of the financial resolution, and that had, by the time the settlement was signed, already triggered a broader investigation by the state medical board into the network of unlicensed practitioners Webb had been connected to. 3 other families came forward during that investigation. Their children had been through different interventions, with different outcomes, but the pattern was the same. A practitioner operating outside any legitimate framework, selling experimental procedures to families who had run out of legitimate options and were desperate enough to take the risk. 2 of those children were now enrolled in the Foundation's expanded program. The third had moved out of state, and the family had been connected with a clinical partner that the Foundation had trained in the methodology earlier that year. Vanessa did not attend the settlement signing. She sent her attorneys. She spent that morning in a session room at the Foundation, sitting in on an assessment for a 4-year-old named Iris who had been diagnosed as profoundly deaf at 18 months and who pressed her whole face against the resonance board on first contact, cheek and chin and forehead, maximizing surface area, instinctively doing what Lila had done in the very first session without being shown how. She sat in the observation area and watched and thought about the word instinct, about how it was often just the body doing what it needed before the mind had cleared enough space to decide, about how much of what looked like talent was actually just a particular kind of desperation, given the right conditions and the right amount of time. She thought about a charity gala and a corridor and a man crouching with his palms open, making himself smaller so a frightened child didn't have to look up. She thought about what it cost to notice things, not just to see them. Seeing was passive, reflexive, the eyes doing what eyes did, but to actually notice, which required bringing your full attention to bear on something that the situation had not designated as important, that no one else in the room had flagged, that you had no official obligation to pursue. Noticing was a choice. It was an act. And it was something that, in her experience with the board members and executives and advisors and specialists who surrounded her professional life, was considerably rarer than intelligence or credentialing or confidence. She had built a company on the ability to identify it in other people and put them where it mattered. She had somehow missed it in herself, in the way that the skills most native to you were sometimes the hardest to see clearly because they were indistinguishable from simply how you moved through the world. She thought, I noticed the mascara on my own face in the hospital mirror the morning after the gala. I noticed the way Lila looked at Logan in the corridor before I understood what it meant. I noticed 11 pages of handwritten notes and knew, before Nair confirmed it, that they were real. Maybe that was the thing. Maybe the thing that connected her and Logan, the thing that had connected them from the beginning, in the corridor, in the 40 minutes when everything shifted, was not circumstance or proximity or the gravitational pull of shared crisis. Maybe it was simply that they were both people who noticed. And that noticing, as a practice, as a mode of being, was lonely work until you found someone doing it beside you. She sat in the observation area and watched a 4-year-old press her face against a resonance board and feel for vibrations in a world that had not yet found a way to reach her, and she thought, we will reach her. That is what this is for. The Sterling Hearing Foundation's formal public launch happened on a Saturday in late April, in a space that Vanessa had rented for the occasion. Not the penthouse, not Whitmore Global Tower, but a mid-sized event venue 3 blocks from the Foundation's offices, with high ceilings and good acoustics and long tables for the families of every child currently enrolled in the program. There were 41 children in the program by then. Not all of them were in the city. 8 were remote participants connected through partner clinicians who had been trained in the methodology over a 3-week intensive that Nair had designed and Logan had co-taught. The waiting list had stopped being counted in hundreds and had started being counted in the time it would take to reach each family at the current pace of expansion, which was the metric that mattered and the one that Logan had taped to the wall above his office desk, where other directors hung mission statements. The venue filled slowly, the way events filled when the people attending them were not accustomed to events. Families with children who navigated the world differently, who had spent years calibrating the environments their kids could manage, who arrived with exit strategies already mapped, and with the specific preparedness of people for whom the gap between what was promised and what was delivered had historically been large. They came in and looked around and looked at each other, and the quality of the room was something Vanessa felt in her own chest. Hope that had been disappointed many times, walking through a door one more time anyway. She stood near the entrance for the first hour, greeting each family personally. Not from a stage, not with a prepared welcome. Just Vanessa, standing near the door, shaking hands and learning names and listening to the things parents said when they'd been given the space to say them without a time limit. She was good at this, had always been good at the specific executive skill of making individual people feel genuinely seen in brief encounters. But this was different from the boardrooms and acquisition meetings where she'd developed the skill. This was different because the things people told her mattered to her in a way that was not strategic or professional or subject to any calculation she'd been trained to make. A woman named Helen, who had driven 4 hours from upstate with her 6-year-old son, told her that before the program she had started to believe that she was failing her child, not that the condition was hard, but that she personally, specifically, was failing him because the resources available weren't working and she had run out of things to try and didn't know how to explain to her son why she kept taking him to new rooms with new equipment and coming home with the same silence. Vanessa listened to all of it. She did not say that she understood, because the specific contours of another person's suffering were not something you could claim to understand from the outside. She said, "He's in the right place now." And she meant it in the plain, direct way, with no performance in it. Logan was across the room, crouched down talking to Darius, the 11-year-old who had arrived furious in January, and who was now 4 months later still prickly and still difficult and also measurably better in ways that the assessments captured and the assessments didn't. The ways that were harder to quantify, the ways that showed up in how he carried himself when he walked into the session room versus how he'd walked in that first day. Darius was saying something to Logan with the intensity that was his baseline register, hands moving, making a point. Logan was listening with the quality of attention that meant he was actually listening and not preparing his response, which was rarer in adults than it should have been, and which Darius, like most children who had grown up managing adult impatience, recognized and responded to. Ethan appeared at Logan's elbow, handed him a cup of something, and immediately got drawn into the conversation with the adaptability of a child who had learned that adults' conversations were often more interesting than the adult-designated activities happening elsewhere in a room. Vanessa watched from across the space. She thought about how you couldn't plan for this. You could build the structure, fund the program, staff the clinical team, rent the venue, arrange the catering. But you could not plan for the quality of a particular man's attention in a room, the way it organized things, the way it made people feel that the space was safe enough to be honest in. That was not a resource you could acquire. That was just who someone was. She had learned, over the past 8 months, to resist the instinct to evaluate everything as a resource. It was the instinct that had made her effective, and the instinct that had made her lonely, and the instinct that she was still, imperfectly, working on. Imperfectly. That was the word. Not in progress, not developing, not on a growth trajectory, just imperfectly, which was the only honest way to describe the actual texture of changing. Lila appeared at her side. She was wearing a dress she'd chosen herself. Blue, because she'd always worn blue, but a different shade than the one from the charity gala a year ago, deeper, more deliberate. She had Earl in the crook of her arm, and she was scanning the room with the careful attention she brought to unfamiliar spaces. Vanessa put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Lila looked up. Okay, Vanessa said. Lila considered the room, then she looked at her mother and said, loud. One word. Clear enough to be understood without lip reading, without context, without anything except the word itself and a slight wrinkling of her nose that communicated her position on loudness. Yes, Vanessa agreed. It is. Lila looked back at the room, then she pointed across it, toward Logan and Ethan and Darius. Go, she said. Not a question, a statement, an intention. Go ahead, Vanessa said. She watched her daughter cross the room, 9 years old, upright, Earl under one arm, moving through a crowd of people with the careful purposefulness of someone who had spent her whole life learning to read the world in ways most people never needed to and who carried that knowledge now, not as a wound but as a particular and hard-won kind of intelligence. She watched Ethan spot Lila from 10 feet away and immediately moved to make room for her in the conversation without breaking stride, the way people did for family. She watched Logan register Lila's approach without looking up, some peripheral awareness, some quality of attention that included the room even when he was focused inside it, and shift slightly to complete the circle. She stood across the space and watched her family on a Saturday afternoon in April, loud and imperfect and completely real. The formal program happened at 7 o'clock, after the children had eaten and several of the youngest had fallen asleep on coats in a corner. Vanessa spoke first, briefly, from notes she'd written herself and then set aside, because the notes were the formal version, and the formal version was not what the room needed. She said, "A year ago I was in a corridor of my own building being told that my daughter had been profoundly deaf since she was 2 years old, and I had accepted that. Not easily, and not without a great deal of grief that I mostly kept to myself, because I am very good at keeping things to myself and very bad at knowing when to stop. I had accepted it the way you accept the things that the most qualified people in your life tell you are permanent." She paused. Then someone who had no obligation to notice anything, who had every professional reason to simply walk past a frightened child sitting behind a potted plant, noticed. And then he kept noticing for 8 months, every day, in every session and every conversation and every moment when the easier thing would have been to step back and let someone more credentialed take over. She looked at Logan, who was sitting in the front row with Ethan beside him and Lila between them with Earl on her knees. What I have learned from that, slowly and not without resistance, is this. Expertise matters. Credentials matter. Clinical training matters. But the quality that this program is actually built on, the thing that makes it different from everything we tried before, is attention. The specific kind of attention that you bring to a person when you have decided that they are worth understanding, not just treating. The room was quiet. Every family in this room has been the recipient of good intentions that ran out of patience, she said. That is not a criticism of the medical community or of the people who tried to help your children. It is simply the reality of a system that has more people in it than attention to go around. This foundation is our attempt to change that equation, not by finding more resources or better technology, though we will pursue both of those things, but by training clinicians to bring a particular quality of presence to their work with your children. To notice, to stay, to understand that the child in front of them is not a case to be resolved, but a person building a relationship with a world that has been imperfectly accessible to them, and that the most important thing any clinician can do is make that person feel that they are being genuinely seen. She folded her notes. That is what this is for. That is what we are building. Logan spoke after her. He had not prepared remarks. She knew because she'd asked him the night before, and he'd said he'd figure something out, which was what he said when he was going to think about it, until the moment arrived and then say what was true. He stood at the front of the room and looked at the families assembled there and was quiet for a moment. "I want to say something to the kids specifically," he said. He looked at the children, the ones who were still awake, the ones who were listening with varying degrees of attention. Darius with his arms crossed, and Lila with Earl, and a small girl in the third row who hadn't taken her eyes off him since he stood up. You are going to have bad days in this program, days when it doesn't work, when you're tired, when you've put in everything you have and it hasn't moved. Those days are real and they matter and you're allowed to hate them. A pause. But the work you're doing, the work of learning to navigate a world that was not built with you in mind, and doing that without giving up on the world or on yourself, is some of the hardest work that exists. I want you to know that I see it. The people in this room see it, and none of what you've already done, on the hard days and the days where nothing worked, is wasted. It's all in there. It all counts. He sat back down. Ethan, beside him, patted him on the arm once, with the complete matter-of-factness of a child who was proud of his father and had no self-consciousness about showing it. Lila, on the other side of him, took his hand. She didn't look at him when she did it. She was watching the next speaker approach the front of the room, already tracking for context, gathering information with the focused attention she brought to everything unfamiliar. But her hand found his and held on, easy and certain, the way you held on to things you'd decided were yours. Logan looked down at her hand in his for just a moment. Then he looked at the front of the room and listened. They stayed until the last family had gone, which was close to 10 o'clock. Mrs. Okafor had taken Ethan home at 8:30 when it became evident that he was doing the specific kind of standing up while asleep that 7-year-olds excelled at, and Lila had lasted until 9:45 through sheer determination before falling asleep against Logan's shoulder in a chair near the back of the room while the Foundation's operations director was still disassembling the sound equipment. Logan sat still and let her sleep. Vanessa, beside him, was reviewing something on her phone with the low-level focus she brought to things that didn't require full attention. 41 families tonight, she said quietly. 42. The Hendersons sent their regrets and asked if we'd filmed it. We did. I'll have it sent to them Monday. He looked at Lila's sleeping face. The way children slept was still something that got him. The absolute completeness of it, the full-body commitment, the trust it required to go that thoroughly offline in a world that had not always been trustworthy. Lila had started sleeping that way only in the last few months. Before, she'd slept lightly, shallowly, always at the edge of wakefulness. I wasn't sure when that had changed. He'd noticed it in retrospect, the way you noticed the incremental things only once they'd accumulated into something visible. We need to talk about the partnership with Kellerman Medical, he said. Not tonight. They're moving faster than I expected. Their pediatric audiology team wants to start the certification training in June. Then we'll be ready in June. She put the phone away. Not tonight, Logan. He looked at her. She was looking at Lila. The expression on her face was one he'd seen only in unguarded moments. Not the composed version that ran board meetings and navigated media and managed the precise social machinery of running a public-facing institution, but the other version, the one that existed underneath the architecture of everything she'd built to keep herself functional and effective and intact. The version that was just a mother looking at her child. Okay, he said. Not tonight. They sat in the emptying venue while the event staff moved around them with the careful deference of people who had assessed the situation and decided it was not their place to hurry anyone. The lights dimmed overhead to the lower setting they used for closeout. Outside the tall windows, the city did what the city did. Indifferent, constant, enormous, and entirely unaware of the specific weight of this particular room on this particular night. Logan thought about a thing he'd read once, not in the clinical literature, not in any of the research he'd done, but in a letter his wife had written to him early in their marriage, before any of the difficult things, when they were still young enough to say things plainly without the protective irony that people accumulated over years. She had written, "The most human thing there is to insist on connection in the face of everything that argues against it." She'd been talking about something small and specific, a fight they'd had, a reconciliation, but he had kept the letter and the sentence had stayed with him, the way certain sentences did, lodged in a place that resisted forgetting. He thought about it now, about the degree to which everything in the past year had been an argument against connection, the wrongness of the situation, the disparity of their circumstances, the skepticism of boards, and the scrutiny of headlines, and the simple practical weight of two people with complicated histories and existing obligations trying to navigate something new without breaking the things they'd already built. About how they had connected anyway, slowly and imperfectly, and without any of the conditions that romance required in the version of the story where everything was clean and nobody had a past. The real version was messier. He was still not a morning person, and she ran on 4 hours of sleep in a way that baffled him. He had a 7-year-old who was extremely opinionated about breakfast and an old truck that she had diplomatically never once commented on. She had a company and a board and a level of public visibility that he found genuinely uncomfortable and that she had spent years learning to use rather than escape. They argued sometimes about the foundation, about pace and risk and the difference between what was clinically sound and what was operationally achievable. And those arguments were real and sometimes didn't resolve the same evening they started. He was not easy to reach on certain subjects, and she was not easy to redirect once she'd decided something. And they had both, over months, had to learn the difference between the version of the other person they'd initially constructed and the actual person, which was always more complicated and almost always more worth knowing. He thought, this is not a miracle. This is just two people who kept showing up. And he thought, sometimes that's the same thing. He didn't say any of it. Some things didn't need to be said because they were already understood. He was still learning when that was true and when it was just old habit, the old reflex of keeping things inside because the outside had not always been safe for them. But tonight, he thought it was true. The room was quiet enough, and the moment was settled enough that the unsaid things were simply present, hanging in the air between them like the last of the evening light, known without being named. Vanessa turned her phone over in her hands. 42 families, she said. 42. The waiting list is 408. We'll get there. I know. She looked at Lila. I know we will. A pause. I keep thinking about Helen, the woman from upstate, what she said about feeling like she was failing. I know. Because I felt that for years. Not the same way. My circumstances are different in every way that matters. But the specific feeling of running out of options and not knowing how to tell your child that you're still looking, that you haven't stopped, that you just don't know where else to look. She paused. I want to make sure that's what we're actually solving, not just the clinical gap. That specific feeling. He looked at her. That's why the family support component matters. I know. I'm not questioning the structure. I'm just... She stopped. I'm telling you what I'm still thinking about. Even tonight. Even after everything that went well tonight. She looked at him. I'm still thinking about the 408. That was the thing about her, he thought. That was the specific thing that had disassembled whatever defenses he'd been maintaining in the months after they met. Not the intelligence or the capability or the particular force of her attention when she chose to aim it. But this, the fact that the 408 kept her up at night even on the nights when the 42 were there to celebrate. The fact that success did not quiet the awareness of what remained undone. The fact that she held both simultaneously and refused to let either cancel the other. He knew that feeling. He had lived inside it for most of his adult life. We'll get to 408, he said. And then there'll be more after that, and we'll get to those too. That's what this is. He paused. That's what we signed up for. She looked at him with the expression she used when he'd said something she intended to hold on to. We, she said. We, he confirmed. Lila stirred against his shoulder. She didn't wake, just shifted, resettling, one hand finding the arm of the chair and gripping it briefly before releasing. Earl was wedged between her and the chair back, guarded even in sleep. Vanessa watched her daughter for a moment. She said my name last week, she said quietly. Not Mom. My name. She called me Vanessa. Logan looked at her. When? She was annoyed with me. I wouldn't let her stay up to see the end of a program she was watching. She looked at me and said, Vanessa's voice caught briefly, then steadied. She said, Vanessa, please. Very clearly, very deliberately, with the specific tone of a 9-year-old who has decided to try using your full name as a persuasion strategy. Did it work? Of course not, she paused. I went and cried in the bathroom afterward. She looked at her hands. Not because she called me Vanessa, because she said it the way someone says a name when the name belongs to a real person. Not just Mom the concept, me, specifically me. She paused again. I've never... She stopped. Started again. I didn't know what it sounded like. To hear her say my name and know that she knew exactly who she was saying it to. Logan looked at the window. The city moved outside it, patient and endless, indifferent to the specific weight of this particular moment in this particular room. He thought about the night in the hospital corridor, the sound of a child crying, heard through a closed door, a coffee cup, and a question. How are you doing with it? He thought about all the ways a person could be reached. Sound was just one of them. It was the one they'd spent a year working on, and it was real, and it mattered, and it had changed things. But it was not the only one. It had never been the only one. He looked at Lila sleeping and thought about his own son asleep across town, probably with his book on the floor where he'd dropped it when he fell asleep. He thought about what it meant to be responsible for a small person. Not the logistical weight of it, which was considerable, but the other thing, the thing underneath the logistics. The fact that every day you were making choices about what kind of world you were demonstrating to them. What you noticed, what you stayed for, what you got back up and tried again after. He hoped he was getting most of it right. He suspected he wasn't getting all of it right. He kept going anyway, because that was what you did, and because the alternative was not something Ethan Pierce deserved, and because, he thought this clearly, without flinching from it, because Logan Pierce had not always been someone who knew how to stay, and had had to learn it the hard way, and the learning had not been graceful, but it had been real, and it was his, and he was using it. That was what you did with the hard things. You didn't leave them behind, and you didn't let them be the only thing. You found the place where they were useful, and you brought them there. Ready? Vanessa said. He looked at Lila. She's going to wake up grumpy if we move her. I know, she gets that from me. She stood and stretched briefly, the gesture of a woman whose body was reminding her of the hour. I'll get the car. I can carry her. I know you can. She picked up her bag. That's not why I'm getting the car. He looked at her. It's late, she said simply. And she's heavy when she's completely asleep. And I have a car service. She looked at him with the expression she used when she was making a point without underlining it. Let somebody help you occasionally, Logan. He held her gaze for a moment. Okay, he said. Thank you. She turned toward the exit, then stopped, turned back. For what it's worth, she said, you were right. About noticing. About what this is built on. You said it in the board meeting. You didn't call it that, but that's what you meant. She looked at him steadily. I just want you to know that the thing that makes you good at this is not something you can train into a clinician who doesn't already have it. Some of them will have it. The ones who do will learn the methodology and it will work the way we're hoping. But the reason it works at all, the reason it exists at all, is because one specific person, in one specific corridor, made a choice to look twice. She left before he could respond, which was probably, he thought, intentional. He looked at Lila. She had one hand on Earl's ear now, gripping it in sleep. Her face was slack and unguarded and young, in the way that sleeping faces always were. The careful management of the waking hours dissolved, and just the actual face underneath showing. He thought about what her face had been in the corridor. The terror, the flinch, the careful, cautious reappraisal. He thought about the small hand that had reached for his sleeve. He thought about 3 taps on a conference room table and 3 taps back. He thought, she found me before I found her. In the sense that matters. She reached first, in the only way she had, and I just happened to be paying attention. That was the thing about noticing. It was collaborative. It required someone willing to be seen as much as someone willing to look. He picked her up carefully, Earl and all, and she made a small sound of protest without waking, and he held her against his shoulder the way he'd learned to hold Ethan in those early years, weight distributed, child-anchored, everything steady. Outside, the car was waiting. Vanessa was standing beside it, holding the door, not looking at him with any particular expression, just holding the door, waiting for him to come through it, which was also its own kind of noticing. He walked through. The city wrapped itself around them as they drove. The lights and the motion and the enormous indifferent living of it, 10,000 stories happening simultaneously in buildings that passed the windows. Every one of them specific and real and mattering completely to the person inside it in ways no one else would ever fully know. This was the story. Not the one with the clean resolution and the declared lessons. The one where a year of hard and incremental and imperfect work had produced 42 families in a room and 408 still waiting, and a 9-year-old girl who said her mother's name with the deliberate specificity of someone who had learned, at cost, that the people in your life were not a background condition, but a choice you made and remade, and that the making was the thing, the actual thing, the only thing that held. Lila slept against his shoulder. Vanessa sat across from him in the back of the car, reviewing something on her phone with the reading glasses she'd started wearing and pretended not to be wearing, and the lights of the city passed across her face in intervals, and she looked up once and caught him looking and did not look away, and neither did he, and that was enough. That was in fact more than enough. The car moved through the city, and the city continued, and in the morning Ethan would ask about the anglerfish, and Lila would press her hands to her fish tank glass, and somewhere 408 families would wake up still waiting, and the waiting was real, and it mattered, and the work would continue, imperfect and specific and entirely worth doing, for no reason more complicated than this. Because people were worth the attention, and always had been, and someone had to keep choosing to notice.